Deep beneath the surface lie secrets from America's darkest days.
We're starting to come over something right now.
Hidden evidence of the bloodiest war in U.S. history, when this nation almost tears itself apart.
Mag's going crazy.
You've got something big here.
It's big.
Stories are now emerging that tell of a revolution in warfare.
Earlier conflicts employed both ships and troops on land. The Civil War took it to a whole new level.
This is war waged not just by armies, but entire societies. A remorseless conflict over land, food, and money, raging in every corner of the world.
The American Civil War was an all-encompassing experience. It was a war that involved the entire economy of both sides. It spread itself through the entire social fabric.
This was total war. In total war, you sink everything the enemy sends in.
April 1861. 11 southern states break away and form the Confederate States of America. In the years that follow, cannons roar and muskets crackle across Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. But what does a wreck in a Florida river reveal about the forgotten battle lines of the Civil War? The state of Florida is a bastion of the rebel Confederacy. Although it's a full 700 miles from the front line, it's a vital breadbasket, supplying the South's army with everything from pork and beef to corn and potatoes. "12 miles south of Jacksonville,
That's Mandarin Point right there, right?
Right in front of us.
maritime archaeologist James Delgado and explorer Keith Holland are on the St. Johns River. The team's magnetometer is picking up a powerful signal from the riverbed,
Mag's going crazy.
the unmistakable signature of a shipwreck.
There's something there.
Sonar equipment generates an image of what's down there.
All right, it looks like we're starting to come over something right now.
A chunk of metal rests on the bottom. A tantalizing hint of a wreck buried in sediment. But the black water creates an impenetrable cloak.
The visibility in the very bottom is zero. You are swimming in a thick, viscous suspension of mud.
Literally, when you dive, there are times you can't see your hands in front of your face.
The team deploys a sub-bottom profiler. Its low-frequency sound waves penetrate the sediment and return data on the structure hidden beneath the mud. Combining this data with reports from exploratory dives, we can reveal what no camera could ever see. As the water begins to drain away, the object picked up by the sonar is revealed. A rusted 40-foot length of iron. It's the axle of a paddle wheel. Stripping back the black Florida mud exposes wooden planks. The remains of a long deck. And more rusted metal. The broken leftovers of 2 smokestacks and a boiler. This is a side-wheel paddle steamer. 50 years after their invention in 1807, paddle steamers had come to dominate the rivers of the American South as transporters carrying trade goods, mail, and people. So what can this one tell us about the Civil War? Keith hunts for answers deep within the wreck. Diving the dark waters of the St. Johns, archaeologists must rely on touch But deep inside the ship, Keith's team makes a massive discovery. Hundreds of wooden boxes, mostly intact. Each one inscribed with faded letters.
Every single box we opened up had somebody's name on it and their regiment. This was a United States Northern military transport.
The wreck is a fascinating time capsule containing more than 6,000 items. Belt buckles with the insignia U.S. confirm that the boxes belong to the Northern Union Army. But there are no firearms and not one case of ammunition.
We expected we would find primarily military weapons, military gear. In fact, what we found was mostly personal items.
Toothbrushes, smoking pipes, molded clay checkerboard pieces, and chessmen. Ordinary, everyday objects. Keith's discovery is one of the largest recoveries of Civil War artifacts ever. But what was this paddle steamer doing, carrying toothbrushes and chess pieces deep into the Confederate South? Searching through military reports, Keith discovers that a Union paddle steamer was lost in the river in 1864, 3 years into the war. The Maple Leaf. It's a civilian vessel being used by the Union Army, not carrying troops, but transporting the belongings of 3 regiments, an occupying force. The Maple Leaf is an important cog in the Union war machine, the support boat for an infantry invasion. The Union wants to take control of northern Florida and cut off crucial supplies flowing to Confederate soldiers on the front lines. So how did the transport ship end up at the bottom of the St. Johns River? Jim and Keith look for clues in the silt.
A couple of meters of good data down there.
By combining the subsurface information with archaeological and historical research, we can return to the drained wreck and reconstruct the exact shape of the hull, buried below the river bottom for the first time since it sank. The 180-foot-long wooden vessel remains largely intact. But on the starboard side, the structure appears to be punctured. The damage at the Maple Leaf's bow almost certainly caused it to sink. Hunting for an explanation, Keith digs further into the historical records. He uncovers eyewitness testimony given by the ship's pilot, local navigator, Romeo Murray.
For 16 years, I've been acting as a pilot on the St. Johns River, and between that...
He describes a clear, moonlit night and reveals some key evidence.
He's holding the wheel, and all of a sudden, Romeo describes the whole pilot house being raised up and then falling forward. And standing up, he smells powder, black powder.
There are no other ships on the river and no cannon fire from the shore. So who or what delivered the fatal blow? Keith finds the reports written by Confederates defending the river. They reveal that the Southern forces employ a new tactic. They plant homemade river mines, moored just below the surface of the water. The Civil War equivalent of IEDs. They call them torpedoes, and they are highly controversial.
One of the things about the American Civil War is that it pushes the boundary of what's considered acceptable in warfare. There was a sense on both sides when the war began that putting a torpedo in the path of a ship was somehow a violation of the rules of war. It was inhumane behavior.
For the Confederacy, there's no choice. It's a rural economy, lacking military resources, desperately trying to land punches on an industrial heavyweight.
The South was always at a disadvantage in the Civil War. In a sense, it was a David versus Goliath fight.
The Confederacy needed to be more inventive, more creative in the kind of naval weapons it employed.
The torpedo was an effective and innovative weapon that has never been used in naval combat until the Civil War.
This is a new, merciless type of conflict, where the old rules of engagement are blurred. Even a transport ship becomes a critical strategic target. It's now possible to piece together the final moments of the Maple Leaf. The Union's campaign in Florida threatens to cut the Confederacy's supplies to the front line, so the South responds in the only way it can, with guerrilla tactics. 4 a.m., April 1st, 1864. The Maple Leaf's hull touches the trigger of a Confederate torpedo. There's a huge explosion. The pilot house topples as the mast falls forward. The ship sinks in minutes. As tactics evolve, the war becomes a remorseless struggle to destroy the enemy's logistics, resources, and supplies. What does a bizarre set of wrecks off the South Carolina coast reveal about the Union's determination to drive the South to ruin? Union commanders are battling for the survival of the United States of America. But they're not just fighting an army, they're fighting an idea, Southern independence. To kill it, they need to target its economy. In 1861, that means cotton.
The Confederacy thought of their cotton as white gold, almost the bullion that would underwrite their economy.
The Confederate war effort depends on exporting cotton to Europe in exchange for vital supplies.
The more cotton that can go out and feed a hungry British textile market means more credit and the ability to buy things abroad.
Abraham Lincoln was convinced if you could limit the availability of critical elements in the South, it could not continue to fight such an all-embracing conflict.
It seems impossible. The Confederate coastline stretches 3,500 miles. It includes 189 harbors, inlets, and river mouths. How do you lay siege to half a continent?
Let's do the fortified knots, should be good.
Marine archaeologist Jim Spyrick has come to the epicenter of the South's cotton trade, Charleston, South Carolina.
1, 2, 3.
Jim believes this harbor could hold clues to the Union's strategy.
Fish looks good. Let's go.
As he crisscrosses the coastline, his equipment picks up some surprising signals.
Or there's some magnetic readings. A large amount of iron down there. You see anything on the sonar, Ryan?
I mean, there's some relief. There's no real structure to it.
On the southern approach to the harbor, Jim's sonar uncovers an unusual formation.
There's definitely a scatter of material. This looks like...
The scans appear to show irregular mounds. Not just one, but more than a dozen. Almost all long and narrow and shaped like boats. Churned up sediment clouds the water. Visibility is just a few feet. But he can identify an unusual pile of rocks. How did these get here? To find out, we can shed light on the murky South Carolina seabed. As water pours away, it reveals that there are multiple piles of rock resting on the muddy bottom. And pieces of metal, now clearly visible, jutting up from the rocks. Rocks are often used as ballast to control a ship's buoyancy. But there are far more here than any ship would need. What is this ghostly fleet of stone ships? Jim believes clues might lie in the rocks themselves. He retrieves a sample from one of the wrecks. Analyzing the stone, he discovers the rock piles are composed almost entirely of granite.
There are no natural occurring granite outcrops along the South Carolina coast, so these would have had to have been brought in.
But 750 miles away, there is a rich source of this type of rock in Union-controlled New England. These must be the wrecks of Union ships. So why was the Union Navy carrying granite into the heart of the Confederacy? Returning to the drained outer harbor, a closer look at the protruding metal reveals that they are short lengths of lead pipe that aren't normally part of a ship's structure. Jim digs into military intelligence reports. He finds that in 1861, the Union Navy buys a fleet of New England whaling vessels. They fill them with locally quarried granite and set a course south. And there's one further clue. Each is fitted with a pipe and valve. They must be designed to let in water on purpose. The whaling vessels are not the victims of a sea battle. They're scuttled, sunk by their own crews. Jim wants to know why the Union would sail all the way down to Charleston, only to sink its own ships. He compares the location of the rock piles to historical maps of the harbor's geography, where he deciphers the still visible signs of a remarkable Union strategy. In 1861, a natural sandbar blocks ships from entering Charleston Harbor. 5 separate channels offer a safe passage through the bar. The Union Navy scuttles its armada of granite-filled wrecks in the 2 largest channels, and then guards the other channels with warships.
The purpose of the Stone Fleet off Charleston Harbor was to, in effect, completely isolate Charleston from the world.
By the end of January 1862, more than 24 wrecked hulks rise up from the seabed, blocking the main channels in and out of the South's largest cotton trading port. A bold attempt to starve the Southern economy. But historical sources suggest that the Union blockade is far from watertight.
The Confederate blockade runners got in and out with some regularity. And every time that happened, northern newspapers would shout that the blockade was not working, that it was a failure.
The Union has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars scuttling ships to block the entrance to Charleston. Why isn't the Stone Fleet doing its job? Marine archaeologist Jim Spyrick and his team are exploring the drowned remnants of the Union's blockade of the South. Records suggest that the strategy wasn't working. Ships ran the blockade more than 3,500 times in the first year of the war. But how? By clearing the rock from the scuttled New England whaling ships, we can see what lies beneath. The last signs of the original vessels. The remains of their wooden hulls. But also copper fasteners used by shipbuilders to hold the planks in place. But something's not right. If the wooden hull had rotted away, the copper spikes should be standing straight. But these are bent out of shape. Jim's research turns up an account of the Stone Fleet observed from the shore. It describes the wrecked hulks poking up out of the water, blocking the channel. But there's a twist to this story. Within weeks, the scuttled ships are falling apart.
The Stone Fleet really wasn't doing its job because large sections of the shipwreck were breaking away and some of them coming into the harbor itself.
The Union Navy is floundering in its attempt to close off the Confederacy's chief source of income because it fails to factor in the rough winter seas. Atlantic waves quickly rip the hulks apart, twisting the copper pins as the wood is pulled away, leaving behind only their heavy stone cargo. The Stone Fleet is failing. So the Union plows more money into more warships, until as many as 500 ships with a total crew of 100,000 men patrol the southern ports.
More ships, more men were involved in trying to blockade the southern coast than had been involved in all of America's previous naval wars combined.
Soon, every important southern harbor has 20 or more ships circling offshore. Only Wilmington, North Carolina, remains open to Confederate trade.
The total amount of trade in and out of the Confederacy dropped by 90%. The South was constantly gasping for economic breath.
The Union is starving the South of income, while on land, its army inflicts famous defeats at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. But somehow, the Confederacy clings on. What does the wreck of a Confederate ship in the middle of the Atlantic reveal about how the South fights for its life? On August 25th, 1864, the Mary Celestia successfully clears the blockade, carrying 550 bales of cotton from Wilmington. 4 days later, she offloads her cargo in Bermuda, a convenient drop-off point for European merchants. But just 7 days later, on a flat, calm day, she sinks in mere minutes in what should be safe waters. Anthropologist Philippe Rouja is one of a team of experts working to unravel what happened to the Mary Celestia.
This wreck in particular, especially on a day like this where it's starting to kick up, something might get moved or something might get exposed that you had anticipated, but every dive is different.
In the century and a half since the Mary Celestia's sinking, the ocean has buffeted her remains. She's been buried, stripped bare, and buried again as hurricanes lash the seabed. Philippe explores her rusting carcass after every major storm, looking for new clues. But a single dive gives only a snapshot view of the wreck. Now, we can integrate data from archaeological surveys in all conditions and drain the shores of Bermuda. As the water recedes, the blades of a paddle wheel emerge. Remarkably, it still stands upright, even after more than 150 years on the ocean floor. Her bow lies on its port side, sheared off from the rest of the structure. The steamer's engine room remains vertical. And now, fully visible, the ship's riveted all-iron hull. Enough of the ship's architecture survives to reconstruct her. And she's an extraordinary piece of engineering. Unusually narrow for her length, her hull is streamlined. Her powerful engines are oversized. And the paddle wheel blades could be tilted to hit the water at the perfect angle.
Mary Celestia was built to be fast, with a sleek hull, and also with a low profile to help blend in with the environment. An ideal blockade runner.
Confederate blockade runners are specially designed to carry goods swiftly through lines of warships and outrun the Union guns. They drop off their cargo at points in and around the North Atlantic, close enough to the south for a steamer to reach on minimal fuel, but far enough away to escape the Union warships guarding the coast. 3 years into the war, the blockade runners are keeping the Southern economy afloat. By September 6, 1864, the Mary Celestia has already beaten the blockade 8 times in 4 months. Now, she's safe from Union warships in Bermuda and unloads her precious cotton. So with the Union Navy 650 miles away, why does she sink? Searching through local newspapers, Philippe discovers a customs report.
There it is.
It lists the cargo carried by the Mary Celestia on her final planned voyage. Another run through the blockade, back into Wilmington.
So we see here that the records are indicating that she's carrying bacon and 534 boxes of merchandise.
Some details of the report don't add up.
The first thing they say is that she's going to Nassau, and she just absolutely is not. She's actually running the blockade. You know, we know that this log is not accurate. And so what was actually on the Mary Celestia? Well, that is a mystery.
The wreckage of the Mary Celestia still holds secrets. Clues to the Mary Celestia's sinking may lie in what the blockade runner was bringing back to the Confederacy. To uncover the ship's secret cargo, we can return to the drained ocean floor. At the bow, the ship's forepeak now lies exposed. This tight space was used in ships like this for secure storage. Based on archaeologists' data, it can now be reconstructed. When the ship is built, this locker is used by the bosun, the ship's head of maintenance. Now, its wooden compartments are rotted away, leaving the contents uncovered. Among the finds are tins of paint and lengths of rope, a pair of shoes, and a foot-shaped wooden mold used by shoemakers. They could simply be the bosun's personal supplies, but they could also hint at a larger cargo. The discovery of a letter written by the ship's chief engineer, Charles Middleton, contains clues to some of the merchandise declared by the captain as the Mary Celestia left Bermuda.
Charles Middleton describes in one of his letters very specifically the things that he lost on the Mary Celestia. This includes ladies' dresses, barrels of sugar, tea, and 59 pairs of shoes.
Amazingly enough, shoes were in short supply in the Confederacy. Most of the leather manufacturing, most of the shoemaking was up in the northern states. Shoes become invaluable.
Not only does the blockade prevent the Confederacy from getting cotton out, it stops it bringing in daily essentials, hurting Southern morale.
The goal was to asphyxiate not only its military, but its civilian society and demonstrate to Southerners that they'd made a terrible mistake to secede from the Union.
The cargo in the forepeak reveals the Mary Celestia's mission and the pressure on the South. But it doesn't explain what happened to her. Perhaps the discovery of items not listed on the customs report can help reveal the truth.
There are lots of local stories about early divers finding things on the Mary Celestia. They found cases of guns, cases of rifles.
If she was carrying a cargo of weapons and ammunition bound for the Confederate Army, the Mary Celestia would be a prime target for Union warships. But Bermuda is a safe haven, 650 miles from the Union Navy patrolling the Confederate coast. Returning to the drained seafloor, a closer look at the wreck's surviving structure reveals more detail. Her twisted bow is separated from her engine space and the rest of the hull. Whatever caused this destruction did so with huge force. But there's no sign of damage to the boilers. There was no explosion. And there were no sea mines this far from the American coast. The wreck lies surrounded by a different threat: coral. Beneath the ocean surface, a giant reef encircles Bermuda. A lethal barrier reaching up from the seabed.
It's as hard as marble, and a ship hitting that literally gets torn to pieces.
The Mary Celestia must have struck the reef. But reports suggest conditions were flat and calm.
The loss of the steamer Mary Celestia. It is our painful duty to record the loss of that beautiful little steamer.
Philippe learns that on the day she sinks, the Mary Celestia is piloted by an experienced Bermudian navigator, John Virgin. His job is to carefully guide the ship clear of Bermuda's dangerous reef. But the account of the sinking suggests the vessel is moving with reckless speed.
The ship was traveling at 12 to 13 knots. That's fast. I mean, that's really fast.
A local pilot plows into a well-known reef at 13 knots. It could have simply been misfortune. But for some experts, the clues point elsewhere.
In my opinion, there's no way the wreck of Mary Celestia is an accident. John Virgin picked the right spot to wreck her. But it's the perfect spot to destroy the ship while making sure that the crew has a chance to live.
Some believe that John Virgin is a secret enemy of the Confederacy, or a saboteur in the pay of Union spies. If that's true, then he does a very effective job, wrecking one of the best blockade runners of them all. By shutting down its every effort to trade, the Union is slowly squeezing the Confederacy. The idea of an independent South is beginning to die. But 3,500 miles from the American coast, a mysterious wreck reveals a final, desperate Confederate plan to take the Civil War global. June 19th, 1864. A crowd gathers on the cliffs of northern France to watch a fiery spectacle. The last stand of a legendary Confederate warship, the CSS Alabama. The Alabama has been the scourge of the seas, sinking dozens of Union ships wherever she can find them.
There are ships that don't leave harbor because they're not sure that they can get away from the Alabama.
The Union Navy needs to end her reign of terror.
Total of 18 warships were finally sent out to try to find the Alabama.
Finally, in French waters, the Union Navy catches up with its nemesis and sinks her with an hour of continuous fire. For years, historians have wondered just what made the Alabama so deadly. When archaeologists finally locate the wreck, 6 miles out from Cherbourg, on the coast of Normandy, they discover she lies at the very edge of diving technology, 200 feet below the surface, in the frigid waters of the English Channel.
It's deep, but it's also dark. It's cold, the water's fast, and your time is limited.
In these depths, divers have less than 15 minutes on the seafloor before they run out of air. Now, combining the latest sonar data with the archaeologists' observations, we can pull the plug on the English Channel to reveal the secrets of a Confederate ocean raider. At the stern, a cone-shaped ruin, the remains of a propeller fin. Sitting beneath an H-shaped frame, clearly designed to pull the propeller out of the water. The evidence reveals Alabama is powered by steam, but able to lift her prop and travel by sail. And there's something else unusual. The remains of a strange smokestack. It's divided into several sections. This means it was telescopic. It could be lowered. At this time, warships are increasingly clad in iron. But with her propeller retracted and her smokestack lowered, the Alabama looks more like an ordinary merchant sail ship. British maritime historian Sam Willis is an expert in naval tactics. He has a theory about the Alabama's special design features.
The Alabama would approach looking as friendly as possible, but as she got close, she might haul up the colors of the Confederacy, and she would transform from a seemingly harmless merchant ship into an extremely powerful ship of war.
Her disguise means she can sneak up on unsuspecting Union ships. How did the Confederates manage to build such a terrifying wolf in sheep's clothing? The Confederate warship, CSS Alabama, is a hunter. But she's not targeting the Union Navy. She's built like a merchant ship, making her a perfect commerce raider.
The Alabama is specifically designed to overpower other merchant ships.
This is the traditional strategy of the weaker naval power, to attack your enemy's merchant fleet.
The Union is slowly crippling the Southern economy, strangling its cotton exports and choking it of essential supplies. So the Confederacy fights fire with fire and targets the Northern economy, sending the Alabama on a global expedition to seek out Union merchant ships wherever they operate. But how can the blockaded South produce such a devastating warship? Returning to the drained wreck site reveals further evidence. The ship's cannon lie on the deck, just as they were when the Alabama went down. Each is encased in more than a century of concretion, rock-hard mineral deposits clinging to the iron. Archaeologists lift the cannon from the wreck. French conservator Paul Mardikian is the first to lay hands on the weapons. His first job is to remove the mineral deposits.
Generally on shipwrecks, you cannot easily predict what you're going to find. So there's always a surprise factor.
Beneath the carbonate layer encrusting the iron, he discovers a clue, a maker's mark.
The 32-pounders were clearly stamped Fawcett and Preston, Liverpool, 1862.
She may have flown the Confederate flag, but the stamp reveals the Alabama's cannon are not from the South. They're forged across the Atlantic, in Britain. Under international law, Britain cannot supply arms to either side in a civil war. So why is the Alabama armed with British guns? The cannon's manufacturer no longer exists, but its archives and sales records have been preserved. Today, they're held in Liverpool's Merseyside Maritime Museum. Sam Willis discovers a set of plans. Cannon, matching the guns found on the Alabama's wreck. There's no mention of the Confederacy on the plans, only a mysterious set of initials, IDB.
The original drawing of this was sent to IDB. Now, I think that stands for someone called James Dunwoody Bullock. He's a really important person in this naval war.
Bullock's name is well known to British maritime historians. He's a Confederate secret agent operating in Britain.
Britain was officially neutral in the war, but there was a particularly strong link between Liverpool and Liverpool merchants and the Confederacy, and that was because of cotton.
In 1860, 80% of Britain's cotton imports comes from the American South, through Liverpool's docks. But this city is more than a trade hub. It is Britain's industrial powerhouse. The evidence is clear. The Confederate agent wasn't just sourcing guns here, but ships. Sam uncovers Bullock's name on a contract with a local shipbuilder, Laird's. The firm's Victorian shipyard still exists.
What's interesting about this document is that if you look at the dimensions, the construction, the details match almost exactly everything we know about the Alabama, about her hull, her rig, her outfitting. That means I'm confident to be able to say that this is a contract for the building of the Alabama. And that means that the Alabama was built in that dry dock. We know that the Confederates paid for the Alabama to be built, but nowhere in this entire document Does it mention the Confederacy, the Southern states? They exist behind the words like a ghost.
Desperate to strike a blow to the Union juggernaut, the Confederacy builds a secret warship in Britain and releases her into the Atlantic to decimate the Union fleet. In her first month at sea, the South Stealth Raider burns 10 American whalers. She avoids capture while taking on coal in French Martinique, and then wreaks havoc off the coast of Brazil. Her odyssey of destruction takes her all the way to the South China Sea. The Raider makes the Civil War global. By the time the Alabama is caught in 1864, she has sunk more than 60 Union merchant ships. But despite all of its secret tactics and innovations, the writing is on the wall for the Confederates. When Ulysses S. Grant accepts the surrender of Robert E. Lee in 1865, the American Civil War is over. The war that launches modern America has given birth to a new mode of warfare. A war on the water as well as on the battlefield. A war between societies fought over money and resources. Total war. On the 9th of July, 1860, under the cover of darkness, a schooner slips into Mobile Bay on the Alabama coast. She's called Clotilda, and she's carrying illegal cargo. Human beings. 109 enslaved men and women. The last consignment of African captives ever to reach the United States. But this will be her final voyage. That night, she disappears and is never seen again. The story of the Clotilda marks a defining moment in the disturbing history of the transatlantic slave trade.
Life was brutal. It was violent. It was constant. People lived their entire lives under fear of punishment. It was probably as close as we've come to producing hell on earth.
Today, nearly 160 years since her mysterious disappearance, a group of maritime archaeologists are searching for the Clotilda. Here, on the Mobile River, very few slave ships have ever been found. But in Alabama, and in sites all around the planet, archaeologists are making discoveries, finding physical evidence of a trade that sees 12 million Africans carried to the New World in chains. But these wrecks also lay bare a story of hope, revealing acts of rebellion and dramatic escapes, rewriting the history of America.
"52 years after the United States Congress banned Americans from being involved in the slave trade, a group of people in Mobile decided to place a bet.
The bet was maybe $1 million equivalent today, that we can go over to Africa and bring back slaves right under the U.S. Marshal noses. Just a drunken night, and they just decided to make a bet.
In 1860, the importation of enslaved Africans into America is strictly forbidden, though slavery itself remains legal in many states. But ship owner Timothy Mayer is prepared to take the risk. He sends one of his vessels, the Clotilda, to Ouidah in modern-day Benin on a mission to buy human beings. West Africa has for centuries been at the rotten heart of the slave trade. Clotilda's captain negotiates a fee for his living cargo, $12,500, or $375,000 in today's money. In America, they will be worth $5 million. After a 6-week voyage, Clotilda returns to Alabama and disappears. Finding this ship could transform our understanding of the last days of slavery. So for decades, archaeologists have been desperate to track her down. James Delgado is leading a major new investigation. He knows it will be an immense challenge.
What you're contending with is a hot, humid environment, in and out of the water. But also, to be clear, we're in a bayou. There are gators, there are water moccasins. So you're always mindful that the environment you're working in is not necessarily a welcoming one.
Based on Clotilda's last known position, the team focuses upon the Mobile-Tensaw River Delta, a vast region of wetlands a few miles north of the city of Mobile, and discovers that one stretch of the bayou has never been scanned with modern equipment.
This little bend in the river was the only one where no one had looked.
Using underwater sonar, they search for any sign of a wreck.
So there's your bow. Here.
It soon throws up a frenzy of hits.
This area was full of wrecks. It was a ship graveyard.
The team identifies 12 possible targets. Clotilda is known to be an 86-foot-long wooden ship, so the archaeologists can eliminate anything larger and anything made of metal.
It's almost as if we're right in the center of the vessel.
We are in the center.
Target 10 turned out to be an iron or steel-hulled sailing ship that had been cut down. Target 1 also appeared to be one of those.
In the end, just one target remains.
Target 5 was a wooden wreck. Not only was it a wooden wreck, but the sonar showed it to have about the right kind of shape I expected for the bow.
They focus all their efforts on Target 5.
The bow's right here. That's the bow.
It looks promising, but to find more evidence, they must plunge into these murky waters. One of the dive team is Kamal Siddiqui, lead instructor of Diving with a Purpose, a group dedicated to protecting the remains of slave ships.
This was actually the Clotilda. Clotilda being the last vessel to bring Africans into the U.S. That is absolutely profound.
This is about more than archaeology. Many people living on the banks of the Mobile River today are direct descendants of the captives on board Clotilda.
Some of the people that were on that ship would never see their family again. Their lives were turned upside down. We need to know what happened to that ship. Finding the Clotilda, it would bring closure, and it opens up the why, how, and when.
Conditions for diving are terrible, so the search proceeds slowly.
In the water, he was giving feedback on what he was basically feeling, not seeing. The visibility was a bit challenging.
The divers can barely see their hands in front of their faces and must rely on touch to find their way. This is Archaeology by Braille.
I'm just trying to slowly kind of feel my way around it.
Nice and careful. How's your viz down there? Any better?
6 inches.
Okay, 6 inches of viz, heard.
Maritime archaeologist Alex DeCaro communicates with the dive team, guiding them to the site.
Okay, you're on a tree. You're about 15 feet southwest of your buoy drop.
Maneuvering through thick mud, the diver approaches the wreck.
It's monstrous.
Large. Feels all wood.
Oh yeah, it's all wood.
Okay.
Reaching through the dark waters, the divers lay their hands on something important.
Okay, let me take a look.
Jackpot.
It's a large wooden centerboard, a crucial part of mid-19th century sailing ships, especially fast schooners like the Clotilda. A centerboard is a retractable keel that's lowered to give extra stability when sailing on open water. In a shallow river, it can be raised up, leaving greater clearance beneath the ship.
When that centerboard was found or discovered, it was significant. It was a huge, of course, morale booster.
Their discovery helps the team calculate the size of the wreck. It's 13 feet long, meaning it must belong to a vessel about 80 feet in length. And from shipping records, the team already knows that Clotilda is an 86-foot-long Gulf schooner. It's a possible match. Wooden fragments from the site could also help explain its identity. So the team bags up samples for laboratory analysis. But what they really need to do is see the wreck site in its entirety. Now, using their sonar data, it's possible to punch through the darkness, pulling the plug on the murky Mobile River to open up a world hidden for over a century and a half, revealing an astonishing sight. The bones of a spectacular wooden wreck. Her bow is high and immediately visible, while her hull lists slightly to port. Her stern lies buried in several feet of mud. Given how long the wooden hull has been here, it's remarkable so much survives. And buried beneath the silt, traces of something unusual. This wreck may look like a schooner, but most Gulf schooners have a shallow hold. This one is huge. More like a hold found in large ocean-going ships. Could this be an important clue?
The typical Gulf schooner of that time had a low, flat hull for navigating in the shallow waters of the Gulf. Clotilda was built bigger and deeper.
Clotilda's design means she can carry a large human cargo. Finding such a hold on the wreck is another piece of encouraging news, but still not enough to make a positive ID.
The number one thing you have to remember in shipwreck archaeology is the most difficult game to play. It's called pin the name on the wreck.
Before they can pin the name Clotilda to this wreck, the team must go back, armed with every tool at its disposal, to scour every last inch of this site for clues. The tiniest detail might provide vital evidence that this really is America's last slave ship. The search for Clotilda, America's last slave ship, is important because slave ship finds are so rare. Less than 10 have ever been identified. That's why an intriguing story over 1,500 miles away in Costa Rica creates huge excitement. Not one, but two unidentified wrecks. According to local legend, they are slave ships. But are these rumors true?
The locals have known about them for many, many years. They could be slave ships, but they didn't know the names of the vessels or of when they'd actually wrecked.
Archaeologist Lynn Harris is leading an expedition to find out more. Together with her team, she heads for the coast, 15 minutes from the nearby town of Cahuita. Local fishermen guide them to where they think the first of the wrecks lies, around 800 feet off the shoreline.
It is really unraveling a mystery. These shipwrecks are particularly intriguing.
But the usually crystal clear Caribbean waters have been churned up by recent storms. They can't see anything from the surface, and the team has no scanning equipment with them. Visibility is poor, and at first, there's no sign of a ship.
This is really bad today because of the rainfall and the ribbon coming out. Not a bird of coral as of yet.
After 2 hours underwater, Lynn finds something.
Parts of the cannon that are protruding. I lose track of where it goes to.
The cannon appears to be muzzle loading, typical of the 1700s. The right period for a slave ship. But to understand these ships' true purpose, Lynn needs a clearer picture of what's beneath these swirling waters. And by using the data collected at the site, that's now possible. As the ocean disappears from around the first wreck, the seafloor emerges into the Caribbean sunlight. At first, there's barely any trace of a ship. But then, clearly visible, two intact anchors. And 160 feet away, something striking. Lots more cannon. 10 of them, along with what could be more, buried in the silt. The archaeologists think they may have fallen to the ocean floor as the ship broke apart. By measuring their landing points, they can get an idea of the size of the vessel they were on. And it's big, around 118 feet long. That's the right size for a slave ship, and it's armed with multiple cannon. Both important clues.
The rule of thumb on a slave ship was you would carry armament to protect yourself when you went off the coast in case somebody came along to try to interfere with your business or to take your ship.
But there's a problem. This site is hundreds of miles from the main slave trade routes. From the very start of the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th century, slave ships set out from Europe, then sail over 3,000 miles to West African ports that trade in enslaved people.
The captains of slave ships are men who do multiple things. They're sea captains, sometimes they're pirates, sometimes they're people engaged in wars, but they're also salesmen. They have to be able to barter on the coast of West Africa, sell the goods they've got for as many Africans.
At these African ports, they load up with captives, as many as 700 on the biggest ships, and carry them to the New World, where they will be sold and set to work. The whole cruel enterprise comes about because plantations make more money when the labor is unpaid.
The land is in the Americas, the demand is in Europe, and the free labor, the cheap labor, the slave labor is in Africa.
The slave ships return to Europe from the New World, laden with cargoes of sugar, rum, and cotton, all produced by enslaved people on plantations. This whole network becomes known as the Slave Trade Triangle. And Lynn's wreck site is 500 miles away from it. There's nothing in the first wreck to explain what it's doing here. So Lynn turns her attention to the second site, just over half a mile away. Once again, there's no sign of the wooden hull of a sailing ship. The only thing Lynn can find amid the mud and the silt is a single yellow brick. It's not a promising start. But there's more evidence hidden on the seafloor, and we can reveal it by draining away the Caribbean Sea. Not just one yellow brick, but a trail of them, leading to an incredible sight. A vast pile of bricks, tens of thousands of them, all neatly stacked. Lynn concludes that they were in the hold of a ship that has long since rotted away and are now the only visible remains. So can the bricks unlock the identities of both ships and help prove a link to slavery?
Looks like the bricks underneath are all stacked sideways, so they've all slid down the slope.
Lynn takes a closer look. In the early 1700s, different nations favored different styles of brickwork, and these seem Scandinavian.
We looked through archaeological reports and tried to estimate the dimensions of a Danish brick, which was different to the Dutch bricks and the English bricks and the Spanish bricks. And they seemed to fit into the Danish brick more than any other.
Danish bricks suggest Danish ships, so Lynn digs deeper. She uncovers documents belonging to the Danish West Indies Company, mentioning 2 Danish ships lost in 1710. Their last reported sighting is at Punta Cahuita, the exact place where the yellow bricks are lying on the seabed. The Danish records show that both vessels are carrying bricks for the repair of a fort at St. Thomas, a notorious sugar plantation in the Caribbean. The archives also make clear that when they are lost, both ships are also carrying a full cargo of enslaved Africans. What can this astonishing discovery reveal about the reality of life aboard a slave ship? In Costa Rica, archaeologist Lynn Harris has identified two extraordinary wrecks, rare examples of early slave ships. The bigger one, heavily armed with 24 cannon, is called the Fredericus Hortus. It's 144 feet long, carrying a cargo of yellow bricks and 433 African captives. The other is the Christianus Quintus. It's smaller, at 118 feet, with a crew of 60 and 373 enslaved Africans. Using contemporary records and data from the dive, we can reconstruct exactly how these floating prisons appeared and how they worked as they set sail on their final fateful voyage in 1710.
People are herded below deck. They are often chained together. The conditions on the ships are squalid. You can smell the slaver coming.
Air grills around the hull offer extra ventilation to keep the human cargo alive. Above deck is a barricado, a wooden barrier that divides the ship in two to protect the crew in case the enslaved try to fight back. Mounted near the captain's cabin, menacing swivel guns intended not to fire against other ships, but to rake the deck and cut down any rebellious captives. In October 1709, the two Danish slave ships set out for the Caribbean island of St. Thomas. But after 5 months of sailing, they find themselves 1,200 miles off course and desperately low on supplies. By February 18, 1710, disease, dehydration, and starvation have already claimed the lives of 135 Africans on board the two ships. They seek refuge near shore at Cahuita, where, amid a raging storm, both crews abandon ship. The fate of the enslaved men and women on board is a mystery. But local legend maintains that some managed to escape and find a new home among the indigenous community here. If so, it's a narrow escape from a life of endless toil on the plantations. By the 19th century, more than 150 years after the trade first began, around 4 million African captives are laboring on giant prison farms across the Caribbean and American South.
Being demanded to work from sunup to sundown, being rationed food and water, being told when they could go to the bathroom. The future was really grim.
It is a forced labor system that devoured children and decimated families.
The people who ran this system ran it with terror. People were just whipped. People were mutilated. Bits of people's bodies were strung up. There were heads on posts.
Many captives try to escape the plantations, but get caught, and terrible punishments or death will follow. And for those who do make it out, finding their way out of the South is far from easy.
Going to a place unknown, not knowing the language. You had to hide out in swamps, limited amount of food. Just the not knowing what was your next step.
Safety lies in the anti-slavery states of the North, such as Pennsylvania and New York, or in Canada. In the middle of Lake Michigan, one breathtaking wreck may help explain how a lucky few managed to cross half a continent to seal their freedom. It's next to impossible to reach the North without the helping hand of a secret organization called the Underground Railroad. A clandestine network of individuals prepared to risk their own lives aiding runaways. Members guide those fleeing slavery through a series of back roads and safe houses towards freedom.
Whether they're hiding in the false bottom of a wagon, whether they're men who are dressing up as women, whether they're women who are cutting off their hair and being men, they've actually gotten themselves into freedom, but not necessarily into safety.
Some of the most important Underground Railroad routes cut across the Great Lakes.
This would have been one of the last legs of the journey for them, and they potentially were only hours away from knowing what true freedom was like.
Everything about the Underground Railroad is secret, which means evidence of it is hard to come by. But on Lake Michigan, a team of archaeologists is looking for a ship that may play a vital part. If they're right, she will be one of the first so-called freedom runners ever discovered. Their target is named the Home. She's one of countless lake schooners, the workhorses of the Great Lakes in the mid-19th century. Rumored to be part of the Underground Railroad, she sinks in October 1858, somewhere between Manitowoc and Chicago. Archaeologist Mallory Haas prepares to dive on what she believes to be the Home's last resting place.
We're about 6 miles off Sheboygan, Wisconsin, in Lake Michigan. I was really emotional seeing it for the first time. It was just amazing. Out of the gloom came this beautiful vessel in perfect condition.
It's a spectacular sight. Sitting upright in 170 feet of water. But is it really the Home? And did escaping captives use it in their final run for freedom? In the Great Lakes, maritime archaeologists are investigating a unique wreck, trying to discover if it's a rare example of a freedom runner, a ship used to smuggle escaped slaves across the Great Lakes. Now, with data gathered from the lake bed, it's possible to drain these waters. And reveal the hull of a wooden sailing ship. 84 feet long She's clearly an early lake schooner, like the ship the team is searching for, the Home. And she's in remarkable condition. But there is one unusual thing about the wreck. A large impact hole in the hull. Evidence that she likely collided with another vessel on the busy lake. Archaeologist Mallory Haas thinks this could be important.
You can see the remnants and the wood pushing inwards, showing where both vessels came to impact.
Mallory turns to newspaper reports from the time. She finds a story of a collision that takes place in exactly this part of the lake on October 19th, 1858. It describes a vessel loaded with wood and cedar posts taking a blow to her starboard bow. And the name of the ship? The Home. But are the rumors true? Does she help people fleeing slavery to reach freedom? Can the drained wreck provide the answer? Her forward cargo hold is large, 8 feet long by 6.5 feet wide. Enough room for several people to hide inside, alongside her official cargo of lumber. Remarkably, some stray timbers can still be seen today. But there's nothing to distinguish her from any other lake schooner. And for a ship that might be carrying runaways, that's important. Draw attention, and her captain would face arrest. With no firm evidence on the lakebed, the team delves into archives for any scrap of information. And remarkably, finds records of the routes taken by Home's captain, James Nugent. Between April 8th and October 14th, 1848, he makes regular journeys between two ports on Lake Erie, Buffalo and Sandusky.
We know Sandusky is a huge Underground Railroad port. And here's Buffalo, which
Right,
we
and
know.
that was a really large port for the Home as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Both ports are known escape points for fleeing captives and form part of the Underground Railroad.
So if you were to plot all of Nugent's movements, you would probably hit every single Underground Railroad port that there is.
The team also finds records showing that from 1850 onwards, Captain Nugent is plying a new trade route into Canada. It's another important clue, because in 1850, there's a dramatic change to America's slavery laws. Under intense pressure from the South, Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act. In a cruel twist, all escaped slaves must now be returned to their legal owners, even if they are settled in one of the northern free states.
People are being seized. People who have been free for 5 and 10 years are suddenly being hunted down and dragged back into slavery.
So now, there's only one place left to run. Is Captain Nugent carrying captives, fleeing to safety in Canada? The team digs further into his background and stumbles on a remarkable clue. A journal entry published by a Great Lakes Historical Society after Nugent's death.
That party of fugitive slaves was carried to Canada, concealed in the hold of a sailing vessel by a late captain. A man with a conscience and a heart. For many years past, a well-known, honored citizen.
It's proof that Nugent helped people escape from slavery. So his ship, the Home, is a rare and astonishing piece of physical evidence connecting us directly to the final desperate years of slavery in America.
It's a crime scene. And in the United States, we have wiped that crime scene clean of all evidence. There are no clues because we have gotten rid of them in this country.
Ships like the Home help around 40,000 captives to freedom and a new life in Canada. Her wreck is a unique reminder of good deeds in a time of violence and despair. Tension is building between North and South. Civil war is coming. But before it does, slavers sneak one final consignment into Alabama. And in Mobile, archaeologists are trying to identify the ship that they use. The Clotilda, the last ship to carry African captives to the USA. For 160 years, her resting place has been a mystery. Archaeologists have found a wreck on the bottom of the Mobile River that could be her. It's the same size. It's built of the same type of wood. And it's close to Clotilda's last reported position. But all of this could be nothing more than coincidence. The team needs something else to help nail her identity. They head back to the wreck site to look for more evidence. This time, they're deploying the very latest technology, as well as results from the laboratory. Can they close this case? The team lowers a 3D high-resolution scanner to the riverbed.
Just keep letting it out, Mary. Pretty sloppy here.
It should give them a much more detailed view of the wreck.
The sector scan takes a 360-degree view of anything that's exposed above the bottom. We should be about 100 feet aft of the bow, or the exposed portion of the wreck.
New data starts to emerge, immediately giving them a better understanding of the wreck. Inside the remarkable drained landscape, the details of the ship come into sharper focus, revealing what's been learned through the survey and in the laboratory in perfect detail. Right down to the individual planks that once formed the ship's structure. But that's not all. Using the new data, we can zoom in to see intriguing black marks on the ship's centerboard. Burn marks. This ship has been on fire.
This vessel had gone through a fire, and a hot enough fire, to have taken wood and burned it at high temperature, leaving, instead of a thick oak frame, something that looked almost like a carbonized bit of charcoal.
The team turns to the log of Captain William Foster, in command of Clotilda on the day she disappears.
At 12 Mile Island, I transferred my slaves to a river steamboat and sent them up to the canebrake to hide.
He's delivered his cargo and won the ship owners their multi-million-dollar bet. But he has one more thing to do.
I then burned my schooner to the water's edge and sank her.
The reason why Foster burns his ship is simple.
Captains understood that slave trading was equal to piracy and punishable by death.
As Clotilda sinks beneath the waters, any incriminating evidence is consumed by the flames. The dark, secret remnants settle on the riverbed, lost from view for 160 years, but not forever.
You take a look at all of that, and you say, well, short of finding a name, it all starts to match.
This must be Clotilda. To identify the wreck of America's last slave ship is an astonishing achievement. And it stirs up strong feelings.
It was very emotional, just being on the site. It puts you in that place. You begin to think about the people and the incredible suffering that they went through. Now, I have to admit, it brought some tears to the eyes.
Just months after Clotilda sinks, the bitter war between North and South begins. When it eventually ends, 4 long years later, the Clotilda's captives, along with the enslaved in every state in America, are free, finally, from bondage. Clotilda survivors seek a return to Africa, but they're unable to fund their passage home. Instead, some choose to build a community on the banks of the Mobile River. It's still here today, Africatown.
They created this space called Africatown out of a sense of survival to create space that they can call home.
Lorna Woods is a direct descendant of one of the captives on board Clotilda.
These shackles are a legacy passed down through generations. They are heavy. These chains represent being bound down.
We needed something to validate where we came from, who we are, and that ship gave us that connection. I mean, I even get emotional now when I think about the fact that they said we found the ship. You could feel the energy of our elders talking to us and said, we knew the day would come. We knew this day would come.
The whole African slave trade was a crime against humanity. And the Clotilda is a critical piece of evidence. But we have to make sure that those that try to erase it from history, that never happens. That never happens. We never erase this story from history.
Look at that. Oh, my word. Good grief. That is amazing. How long is that one?
Beneath the waters of a Virginia river, a team of explorers is discovering a hidden battlefield from the war that created the United States.
All of a sudden, these objects are forming on the screen that we've never seen before.
This is incredible.
Cannons like that.
Right under the nose of modern America, 240-year-old warships litter the riverbed.
We had 10 wrecks here, just found an 11th. What'd you find? We're working on ships that are the tangible evidence of the event that led to American independence.
These wrecks help us to understand the Revolutionary War in a completely new way.
The naval aspect of the American Revolution is absolutely crucial. It won the war.
The 13 colonies in America rise up against the British king. But their cause looks hopeless. The Patriots are a land-based militia, and at a time when sea power counts, it's Britain's Royal Navy that rules the waves.
The British had command of the seas. As long as they had such extraordinary naval superiority, the Americans were never going to be able to beat them.
So how do the merchants, farmers, and fishermen of the American colonies take on the 18th century's greatest maritime superpower?
Something inexplicable happened. A collection of colonies managed to fight and win a war against the most powerful country in the world.
The struggle for America's waters begins here, in Lake Champlain, Vermont. Can a single, barely armed boat explain how the rebels attempt to prevail against impossible odds? In the fall of 1776, 15 Patriot warships set sail from this stronghold, Fort Ticonderoga, on the southern tip of the lake.
We're on hallowed ground for American history, and the fleet on Lake Champlain should be considered the first American fleet.
The fleet is led by a man who will one day betray the Revolution, Benedict Arnold. His mission, defend these waters against powerful British forces gathering in the north.
Benedict Arnold, while he was here in the Champlain Valley, did heroic things. Lake Champlain is so significant because it's 120 miles long, north and south. Think interstate highway at a time when you can invade on it. Whoever controlled the lake was going to have the advantage in the war moving forward.
At this critical point, the hopes of the Revolution depend on America's first fighting fleet. But within 2 months of launching, Arnold's Navy is in tatters.
Of the 15 vessels in the American fleet, only 4 made it back to Fort Ticonderoga.
What happened? The fate of most of Arnold's fleet is shrouded in mystery. Now, 2 centuries later, archaeologist Art Cohn is hoping to unlock secrets hidden beneath the waters of Lake Champlain.
Where history happens, stuff gets left behind. If there was a vessel that could connect us to that story, that would be the holy grail of it all. Are there physical remains that we can see, touch, study, and enlighten us about what actually happened here?
Art and his team trace the fleet's route north from Fort Ticonderoga, looking for remnants. Sonar sweeps the bottom hundreds of feet below, clearing the lake sector by sector. At last, they detect something promising.
Oh, yeah.
Looks like we got something between 15 and 20 meters in size.
Yeah, that's excellent. Excellent.
All right, cleared 2 meters.
They deploy a remotely operated vehicle and guide it over 200 feet down to the target.
It's amazing.
Look how intact that is. That could be really important for trying to identify which boat this is.
If this wreck really is a sunken warship from the Patriot Navy, it could finally take Art inside the story of their defeat on the lake. But is it? Combining Art's scan data and underwater footage, we can make the waters of Lake Champlain disappear. The mast of a ship that hasn't seen sunlight for centuries breaks the surface. and draining water reveals a giant rusted cannon pointing forward at the bow, resting inside a grizzled 54-foot vessel sitting upright on the lake bed.
It's not broken. It's not a fragment. It's a completely intact specimen transported to the present.
But with only one cannon, this simple boat doesn't look like a weapon of war. However, as Art studies it, he spots a row of fixtures sticking up from the rim of the hull. They're evidence that this ship was once bristling with an array of ingenious weaponry.
8 hand-forged iron brackets indicating exactly the position of all the swivel guns that had been mounted there. They are devastating in close range, anti-boarding, easy to aim, easy to load and fire, and so they would have been indispensable.
Art also finds anchor points on the side for supporting 2 more heavy cannon. He's convinced it's a warship from the Revolution. But is it one of Benedict Arnold's? The surviving cannon and the anchor points for other weapons are key clues, pointing Art towards a type of fighting ship known to be in Arnold's fleet.
The cannon feature, that's a signature, that's a document that tells us this boat is what we expected it to be or hoped it would be.
Art has uncovered an oar and sail-powered Patriot gunboat called a Gundalo.
There's no question the gunboat came from Benedict Arnold's fleet.
A veteran from a forgotten battle for the future of the United States. Combining details from the wreck with research in Revolutionary archives, Art searches for more clues. He spots an unusual box, roughly fastened to the inside of the hull. He's never seen anything like it on a gunboat before.
As I really trained my attention on it, there was ammunition in the box, and I had like a little explosion go off in my brain saying, Eureka, this is an ammo box. This is really cool.
And there's another unfamiliar feature. On one side of the ship, a large notch. Art can't make sense of it.
And I gotta tell you, cutting down the side of the boat makes you more vulnerable to, you know, waves and water, but that's what they chose to do.
As Art tries to work out what's going on, he recognizes something big: the shape of the hull. It's a type of ship design used by colonial farmers to carry hay.
This clearly was a vessel used to travel the rivers and shallow marshes, cutting hay that it could bring back to the farm.
All of these odd features start to make sense.
The British Navy had years of development of discipline and protocol. And that couldn't be a greater contrast to what we were looking at.
The Patriot crew is freelancing. The ammo box is an invention. And they cut a notch because the hull is too tall for their cannon.
They literally robbed or borrowed as much material as they could find. Hey, we've got this cannon, we've got to make it work. It doesn't fit in this spot. Do we raise it or do we cut down the side of the boat? There wasn't a blueprint, and they were kind of making it up as they went.
The Patriots are going into battle with amateur sailors armed with scavenged weaponry in a modified hay barge. Given this information, Art digs into the balance of forces on the lake. He uncovers that the British deploy a powerful fleet of more than 30 boats onto the water of Lake Champlain. On the 11th of October, this dominant force attacks Arnold's makeshift fleet of just 15 near Valcour Island. Art can now see that the Patriots face a hopeless mismatch.
This battle was fought for hours and hours and hours where the cannoning never stopped, they said. Serving aboard the Valcour Island fleet would have been the worst duty you could have possibly had.
With 11 Patriot ships and 60 men lost, the U.S. Navy's first ever battle ends in defeat. But the fate of Art's discovered gondola remains a mystery. It lies more than 24 miles south of the battle, sitting perfectly upright, with no sign of fatal battle damage, and with most of its weapons cleanly removed. So what happened to this mysterious gunboat? Down on the shores of Lake Champlain, Art Cohn is trying to reconstruct the final hours of Arnold's sunken gunboat. A 2-year project to rebuild the adapted hay barge is helping him understand what happened to it.
Welcome aboard. As close a replica as you're ever going to see. This boat is a warship. It's a battleship. It is carrying heavy guns. That was its purpose. Its purpose was to go to war.
Art focuses on why the wreck of the Gundalo is missing its weapons.
Just the firing of the guns and the recoil and the energy that produced would have shaken these planks, just recently built, and shaken the caulking out of them so they would be leaking, and the more they fire, the more they leak.
Somehow, the improvised warship survives the battle, but is doomed nonetheless.
We believe that they jettisoned the heavy guns so that they could lighten the boat to keep it from sinking, but it was leaking so bad they knew it had to be abandoned and let go, and it sank perfectly straight down to the bottom until it landed upright with its bow cannon still in place, searching for the enemy, and its mast still up.
One of the few Patriot vessels still afloat after the battle. The gunboat finally goes down. But there's still more to discover. And Art is helped by an original naval inventory from 1776.
It begins with a return of the fleet belonging to the United States of America on Lake Champlain under the command of Brigadier General Arnold, dated October 22nd, 1776. The odds of it being a document that listed every boat, listed every rig, and then, in a final column, the fate of the vessel.
One ship on the list matches his wreck.
This boat that we found on the bottom of Lake Champlain, this boat is the gunboat Spitfire.
Lost for over 240 years, Art has found the Spitfire. Part of Benedict Arnold's brave but doomed defense of Lake Champlain. However, the sacrifice on the lake is not in vain. The battle buys the rebels some valuable time. Time for a ragtag militia to grow into a formidable army.
Never had there been a fleet, large or small, that had lived to greater purpose or died more gloriously than the little fleet on Lake Champlain.
And over the next 2 years, the colonists fight the Redcoats to a standstill, each side winning battles, from the northeast to the deep south. But on the water, the Patriots still have little to challenge the Royal Navy. Lake Ontario, upstate New York. Can a spectacular wreck on the lake bottom explain how one key American victory was achieved without a single shot being fired? As the war develops, the British use their naval superiority to keep tight control of the Great Lakes, launching the largest warship ever seen on these waters. "80 feet long, with ports for 22 heavy cannon. His Majesty's ship, Ontario, is so powerful, Patriot forces abandoned the region completely.
The British would have certainly hoped that that ship would have been there to police the lake, to fly the flag of British royal power for years.
On October 31st, 1780, Halloween, HMS Ontario set sail with a detachment of 60 troops, heading for the town of Oswego in New York. But she never arrives.
How did a ship built by competent British shipwrights go from being afloat in the middle of a lake to disappearing?
They find on the shore the hat of the captain, they find the binnacle, blankets, and the compass, and that's it.
Shipwreck hunter Jim Kennard wants finally to work out what happened, and asks deep dive expert Dan Scoville to join the search.
The lake hides all kinds of secrets, and just being able to go look for one of these secrets and to discover what happened with it, that's super exciting to me.
Dan and Jim scour for 3 years over 200 square miles of the lake, retracing the Ontario's intended route to Oswego. But they find nothing but barren silt and rocks. Eventually, the only place left to look is one of the deepest parts of the lake. Dan sends his ROV down into the inky black abyss. Over 500 feet down, they find a single wooden longboat. And then, in the darkness beyond,
there was a great big hull right there. And I came up the rear of the hull, and that's when I saw the windows across the stern of the ship. They're still in place after 200 years on the bottom. There's really no other ships out there that are gonna look quite like that. This was HMS Ontario.
And then all of a sudden, there it is. And all of that grief that you've been going through, it all changes.
HMS Ontario, discovered at last. One of the best preserved 18th century warships ever found. So who or what sank her? The only way to find out is to drain away the deep lake waters. And reveal this Revolutionary War masterpiece. 2 masts still stand tall. A row of arched windows. The officers' quarters, perfectly intact. The entire vessel comes into view, lying on her side, with no obvious damage. Even the ship's bell is still in place. The deck and cannon both untouched. For Jim and Dan, the wreck of HMS Ontario is almost too perfect.
You do wonder what happened. Why isn't there a big hole? Where's the hole?
This ship, everything is there. It's solid. It is really solid. So what really happened?
On the Great Lakes, Jim Kennard inspects the wreck of HMS Ontario. There's no clear damage. She's nearly immaculate. On closer inspection, though, not everything is so perfect. At the stern, 2 huge cannons have broken loose and are jammed up against the tiller.
That's very unusual. Those 2 cannons together weighed about 2,000 pounds. So what caused those cannons to be there?
Something violent happened here. But there is absolutely no evidence of battle damage. Jim decides to check accounts of Halloween night, 1780, looking for something unusual. He pulls together old diaries, newspaper articles, and ship's logs from all over the American colonies. But it's an analysis by an expert meteorologist that catches his eye. 2.5 centuries ago, Lake Ontario is hit by a weather bomb.
Something happened very quickly. A backdoor cold front that was from the northeast to the southwest. It causes the temperature to drop 30 degrees in an hour or two with gale force winds of 30 or 40 miles an hour.
Important evidence, but hardly a smoking gun. Even a storm this intense shouldn't have the power to bring down a warship built for the open seas. Jim goes back to inspect the wreck. In the rigging, he spots a small but significant clue. The poles supporting the smaller forward sails are stowed, but the ones for the main central mast are not. This likely means that the Ontario's huge mainsail is still up when the storm suddenly hits. The British crew, unused to American conditions, are caught off guard and unprepared.
The crew was in the process of getting the sails down, but it doesn't look like they had time to finish that job. And in turn, everything went wrong.
For the British sailors, their vast billowing sail triggers a disastrous sequence of events. First, it catches a blast of wind, buffeting Ontario right over. And the loose cannon on the top deck are dramatic evidence of what happens next.
That ship ended up blown over on its side. Now the cannon are hanging, just hanging by the ropes, and those ropes break.
The loose cannon slammed the tiller hard over.
Pushing that ship down into the water, and down into the water goes the sails.
When the huge sails touch water, they act like a parachute and drag the Ontario under.
Now, that ship's not coming back up again. And it slips between the waves and sinks. And as it sits on the bottom today, it's still on its side.
The mystery of HMS Ontario is finally solved. The Royal Navy has come up against an unexpected enemy, the unpredictable weather of a continental landmass. And that's not Britain's only problem. After 5 years of combat, American resistance and stretched supply lines are pushing her war machine to the limit. But the Royal Navy keeps her in the fight, landing and extracting troops along the eastern seaboard at will. And then here, on Virginia's York River, something extraordinary happens. A sudden, decisive change in the balance of naval power, leaving behind an astonishing fleet of ravaged British shipwrecks. Maritime archaeologist John Broadwater has come to Yorktown, the site of the last major land battle of the American Revolution. A battle that hinges on control of the York River.
The American Revolution was right here in Yorktown. In many ways, the Siege of Yorktown can be thought of as much a maritime battle as it was a land battle.
In the summer of 1781, Britain's General Cornwallis occupies Yorktown with 8,000 redcoats and a fleet of ships.
There are troop ships, there are horse carriers, there are food carriers. The entire British Army has just moved here by sea.
The rebel colonists, led by George Washington, see an opportunity for a decisive battle. They advance from New York to surround and besiege the British at Yorktown. But over a dozen Royal Navy ships, including Cornwallis's largest, the 44-gun HMS Karen, dominates the York River. And there is no Patriot Navy to challenge the British fleet.
Cast off.
But now, John Broadwater and his team are uncovering a twist in the tale of the American Revolution, right here under the York River. An unprecedented massacre of the Royal Navy.
There was a terrible disaster here for the British, and we have the evidence out here to prove that.
Look at that. Oh my word. Good grief. That is amazing. How long is that one?
So far, John and his team have detected 11 wrecks under these waters. And they believe they're all from General Cornwallis's fleet of ships.
This is literally a graveyard of British ships on both sides of the river. It's an incredible and unique resource found nowhere else.
So how could a fleet from Britain's imperious navy be brought to its knees? Only a careful inspection of the scattered remains can reveal the answer. 3 wrecks have been picked up on sonar in the northern sector of the river. John dives on the largest target in the group.
John, topside, comms check.
I'm just down at the bottom.
Roger.
I can see the wood frames or ribs of the ship. Here's something very interesting in diagnostics. I found some copper.
Copper is an unusual find on an 18th century wooden ship. What do the surprising ruins of this Royal Navy warship reveal about the turning point of the battle for Yorktown? John Broadwater's team on the York River has discovered copper in the remains of a Revolutionary-era British warship. It's a curious find. To unravel the mystery of this strange sunken vessel, it's now possible to combine all of the available evidence and drain the York River and reveal the remains of a 2-century-old veteran of Cornwallis's doomed fleet. the outline of a 140-foot beast embedded in the silt. Much of the old wooden vessel is missing, but the riverbed is hiding more of the wreck's remains. Draining the silt reveals the underside of the hull, exposing the remains of copper sheeting.
That's awesome.
The wreck has a fast and hydrodynamic copper bottom. John knows it's rare and cutting edge at the time of the Revolution.
Copper sheeting was a technological advance that put Britain so far ahead of the other navies. That's really significant.
When John looks into General Cornwallis's fleet, there is only one ship as big as his wreck, fitted with a copper bottom. It's a major clue that points to the mighty 44-gun HMS Karen, the primary vessel controlling the York River for Cornwallis.
And this clearly had to be Karen. Positive ID.
It's an incredible find, but also puzzling. The Americans have nothing that can match such a powerful warship. So why does so little of her remain?
HMS Karen was very important to Cornwallis. She was the largest ship that he had at his disposal, very powerful and formidable, and put him in charge of the sea around him.
John hopes there could be clues to the ship's fate in artifacts recovered from the wreck.
Here's one piece.
Oh, yeah. Well, these are nice examples of Karen's copper sheathing. You can see this piece is still attached to the wooden hull.
Then, John spots a piece of copper that looks highly unusual.
It's got to be melted copper that used to be a piece of nice sheathing, melted into a glob. Look at all the little holes and bubbles. It must have just started to boil almost. To get copper to melt, it was over 1,000 degrees centigrade. It's almost 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
Melted copper can mean only one thing. A fierce fire on board HMS Karen. Cornwallis's prized ship goes down in an inferno.
This must have just been a horribly intense fire. The frustration that the British must have felt at losing their largest warship to a tragedy like this.
But what can possibly have caused this kind of blaze out on the river? Harvard historian Maya Jasanoff has taken up the investigation. And she thinks it's highly unlikely that the Patriot militia had the firepower to take General Cornwallis's flagship down in a blaze of flames.
The best way to think about these 18th century ships of the line is to think about them as tanks. They are built to last and withstand a lot. I think the American shot trying to pick at the Karen wasn't going to be very effective.
To take on the HMS Karen, Maya thinks the Patriots must have had help. A powerful ally now joining the fight against the British. France. On August 30th, 1781, the French Navy blockades the York River. General Cornwallis and his ships are now trapped at Yorktown.
Yorktown is the moment that brought France into the war on the American side. My enemy's enemy is my friend kind of alliance.
What did the French have that could possibly have destroyed the key British ship, HMS Karen? When Maya looks into it, she discovers the French send ground forces to join the siege, placing artillery on the banks of the river.
The French have very up-to-date technology to help the American-French war effort.
And when she analyzes their gunnery, she discovers they have a very special weapon in their arsenal. portable furnaces that can heat cannonballs until they're red hot.
The French had this kind of artillery. It was called Greek fire.
But could simply heating some cannonballs really be enough to destroy a top-of-the-line warship? Maya visits a forge to test the French technology.
A red-hot cannonball, let's see what that does to a piece of wood. It's obviously going to burn, and it started burning immediately, but it's taking it a while. Let's try it out on some sail and see what happens. It does work. Wow, that's also spreading incredibly fast. When it hit sail, it really ignited.
Maya is now convinced that if French hotshot hit the sails of HMS Karen, it would have sparked an instant inferno.
Timbers would have been burning, the spars would have been burning, the rigging would have been burning. By the time it would have sunk, it would have been in terrible shape. It totally makes sense why the Karen would have ended up at the bottom of the water.
The results of the hotshot demo are impressive, but Maya digs for further evidence that might confirm her theory. She finds a passage in an old diary.
So this is a first-person account of what happened on the night that the HMS Karen went down by an eyewitness. A red-hot shell from the French battery set fire to the Karen, a British 44-gun ship enwrapped in a torrent of fire, which, spreading with vivid brightness among the combustible rigging, it's really an extraordinarily vivid description of the effectiveness of this French hotshot.
It's now certain the melted copper sheathing on HMS Karen is evidence of an unexpected assault by French hotshot artillery. Could this revelation explain the graveyard of British wrecks John Broadwater has discovered in the York River? The team dives the sunken group near the Karen.
Diver up! What'd you find? Look at that. What do we got here? You got it? Yeah. Looks like a piece of charred wood. Another good clue.
Could this be evidence of another victim of French fire?
This is close to the Karen. It's only a few hundred yards away from the Karen. It's got evidence of burning.
Hotshot clearly sides into Cornwallis's trapped fleet.
This grouping of shipwrecks at Yorktown would not be there had it not been for the French. With every wreck we investigate, we add one more piece to the puzzle of how they relate to American independence.
But the war's not over yet. What does this wreck, free from any battle damage, reveal about Britain's last desperate plans to win the Battle of Yorktown? In the York River, Virginia, British ships have been scattered and sunk. But these are not the only ships downed in the battle. Just outside General Cornwallis's position at Yorktown, by the southern bank of the river, a row of sunken vessels sits in an eerily straight line. And assessing his underwater footage, maritime archaeologist John Broadwater is struck by the excellent condition of one of the wrecks.
It was so well preserved, it immediately caught our attention. That's very unusual. Parts of decks, bulkheading, so many features.
Why is this pristine ship at the heart of a dense cluster of wrecks? By stitching the murky underwater footage together, we can now reveal this wreck as never before. The stumps of two masts break the surface. A wooden vessel 74 feet long, with a deep hull. What was this ship? Inside the hold, engraved on the cask, 2 mysterious letters. John digs back through the logs of the British fleet at Yorktown. He discovers the engravings are the letters JY, and they tally with a ship captain's name.
And this was Joseph Younghusband, and his ship was called the Betsy.
It's an incredible discovery. The Betsy is a valuable military supply ship. But why is she sunk with barely a scratch? On the drained wreck, John finds something strange in the bottom of her hull.
All of a sudden, there's this rectangular opening. It looks like it's actually been chiseled out, just this one little block. This is really strange. There's only one thing this could be. This is definitely what sank the Betsy.
The purposely cut opening is a scuttle hole that allowed water to flood the hull. But why would General Cornwallis deliberately sink his own valuable supply ship? John uncovers an 18th century painting of the siege of Yorktown that he believes holds vital clues.
Washington and his Generals by Charles Wilson Peale. You can see the generals lined up here, but look how much larger the painting is and how much more it takes in. And some of the detail is much more interesting. Over here we have the edge of the York River and the Yorktown shoreline. And if we look closely, what do we see? We see masts and yards of sunken ships.
Comparing the setting of the painting with a map of the York River reveals a stunning correlation.
This is a whole row of ships right along the beach, just as we've found in our archaeological evidence, and very likely one of these is the Betsy.
But it's seeing her masts jutting out of the water with the other ships that is a real revelation for John.
These ships' masts and the yards clearly present a solid barrier that would prevent these French ships out in the distance from launching troops and small boats and making attack on the shoreward side of Cornwallis's position. That really brings out why it was there, how effective this sinking line was against a French amphibious assault.
The glorious fighting ships of the Royal Navy reduced to the role of a sunken barricade, like so much scrap.
Now, the hole that we found in Betsy, that hole makes perfect sense. Scuttle the ship, blockade the French, protect your position.
The wreck of Betsy provides the final chapter for the graveyard of British wrecks. The Royal Navy, once so dominant in these waters, is now simply cannon fodder in General Cornwallis's desperate last stand.
It's a whole evolving picture of increasing desperation, increasing loss of resources until the final end.
After 2 weeks under siege, and with no way to escape by sea, Cornwallis runs desperately low on food and ammunition. On October 19th, 1781, he surrenders.
Everything finally works for Washington, just the way he hopes it will. British troops come out, they play the world turned upside down, because that's exactly what it was for them.
Yorktown proves to be a decisive victory for the Patriots. 2 years later, in 1783, the signing of a peace treaty ends the war. America has won her independence, and the United States is born. A nation forged by the sacrifice of the ships and men. Revealed in the incredible evidence deep beneath her now peaceful waters.
Deep inside the labyrinth of a flooded cave system,
All of a sudden, the floor just drops.
divers come across human remains
You can see these dark eye sockets kind of looking back at us.
and the bones of giant prehistoric creatures.
Saber-toothed cats, bears, giant ground sloths.
Discoveries that could revolutionize our understanding of how the first humans came to the Americas.
They must have come here another way.
We have 800 miles of underwater tunnels that have been mapped. We think there is another half still to be discovered.
A team of divers is exploring the world's largest underground flooded cave system.
It's like a labyrinth of tunnels everywhere, almost like a Swiss cheese in the ground full with water.
Their aim, to survey this lost world, sealed off from humanity since the Ice Age.
The Yucatan is special because all the caves here were once dry. We know this because of the stalagmites and the stalactites, which only form in a dry cave. About 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, the ice sheet melted and the cave began to flood.
Now, these flooded caves pose grave risks to the divers.
Caves can be very dangerous. You have, going in an environment where if you have a problem, you cannot ascend. The tunnel that you're traveling is totally dark. Your lights now don't have a way to see. If you go in a small area, you could get trapped inside the cave. So there's a lot of risk.
The team's goal is to map this complex network.
When we go into these tunnels, we do a very simple map of the cave. Then we bring the camera, and then what we do is we take a lot of images.
It's taken 150 hours to map as far as this point. And now the divers stop.
All of a sudden, the floor just drops. We have this really powerful underwater lights, and all you could see was darkness. So like the biggest, darkest hole we've seen on the cave.
Using the divers' own data and imagery, the scale of the abyss becomes clear.
If we were to drain the water, we will see this bell-shaped structure. Maybe like a football field, a stadium kind of size.
They name the vast cave Hoyo Negro, Black Hole.
As we descended into the pit, we were moving our lights, trying to figure out what was down there.
Anything Alberto and his team find here will come from prehistory, when the abyss was a dry cave.
And then we saw a bone.
It was a really long, tall bone. We moved around it, and then we saw another bone.
We started noticing that there were remains all over the place on the floor. Whatever there were, it has to have been a really big animal. We knew we found something really important here, so we mapped everything in the cave, recorded the exact locations of the bones, and took photos. And then we sent all our data to our colleagues in California.
Our goal is to capture these places, these wild places, using our visualization systems.
Here I'm just gonna go through the different views. So we're now just kind of reliving the dive path.
In 2014, Dominique Rizzolo and his team begin to process the divers' mapping data and images. Their aim is to create a 3D digital replica of Hoyo Negro, which they can explore from dry land.
The divers have tremendous experience in doing different kinds of documentation underwater, and we're able to take all of those images and through computer vision algorithms, translate them into a 3D model. And it's really essentially a point cloud, a cloud of points.
So far we have around 15 billion reconstructed points. The exciting thing is it grows every year. So every time they go diving, take pictures, we run new reconstructions, we just add to the set.
The way that we can create maybe a more photorealistic 3D model is by then texturing those points with the original photograph. So these are high-resolution images that can be essentially draped onto this 3D point cloud.
Wow, so here we are at the bottom of Hoyo Negro.
This is one of the most powerful virtual reality systems in the world. Being inside the Sun Cave is similar to being on the dive itself, with the exception that you're able to be well lit. You're able to see everything that you can't see.
This is essentially an interactive digital twin that enables us to come here and do virtual dives. And sometimes even find new animals, finding new animals in a virtual cave, right? So exploring a real cave by using a virtual one. The first big animal that the divers came upon was right here, this Gomphothere. It wasn't as if it was just this proboscidean, this relative of the elephant. It's such an incredible diversity of Ice Age fauna. Bears, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths. Just amazing. So Joel, if you take us sort of onto the wall of the cave here, we can see this saber-toothed cat emerge, Smilodon fatalis. Clinging to the wall, we see, another scapula, of course, the scapula over here of the giant ground sloth. We have some ribs.
By examining the bones, Dominique's colleagues identify at least 16 Ice Age species.
Whether they were looking for water or to build a den or even to hunt, these are massive animals that were walking through these passageways, coming to the edge of this precipice and making their way to the bottom of this pit. It's a really wonderful view into what the planet was like at a time thousands of years ago. As incredible as those discoveries were, that wasn't the only thing they found that day.
We were swimming at the bottom of the side, looking at the animal remains. And then all of a sudden, my friend Alex just moved his light and he pointed a particular direction.
Within touching distance, at the bottom of the vast flooded cave system, diver Alberto Nava and his team are about to make the discovery of a lifetime.
We see this beautiful cranium. It's just sitting upside down. You can see these dark eye sockets kind of looking back at us.
My blood ran cold. I mean, my hairs stood on end.
I don't think I'll find anything like that in my exploration life. This is probably the best it's ever gonna get.
All these things come to mind. Who was this person? You know, how did they come to be here? When did they arrive at the bottom of this pit?
Hay que recordar que este es un proyecto de primer nivel y somos un gran equipo.
To help find the answers, the team consults experts from around the world, led by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History.
We have now over 30 scientists and engineers involved. The paleontologists, the archaeologists and anthropologists, who are all helping to put together this puzzle.
We have a fairly consistent 3,000-year offset between.
As a project, we made the decision to reach out to Jim Chatters, who had the experience and expertise we really needed to understand the significance of the site of Hoyo Negro and everything it contained.
I mean, you just don't see this kind of preservation. So it's just unbelievable quality.
The first question on the team's mind, who is this person at the bottom of the cave?
I shared photographs of the discoveries, and his eyes lit up. I could see his hands trembling a little bit.
And here's our human. The skeleton is it's a diary of someone's life, and it's especially a diary of their early years. This is a really good picture here. Here's the telling piece. I can see, first of all, that a feature in the base of the skull called the basilar suture was still open, and that tends to close somewhere around the 20s. And it was not only a full-size skull, but the third molars had already erupted. So it's a fully formed tooth, or nearly fully formed, which puts us more than 15 years old. In looking at this right away, I'm thinking 16 to 19 years is the most likely age of this individual. To determine the sex of a skull, you're looking at how rugged it is, mainly. In this case, what I did was I look at the mastoid processes, and that's the position on the skull here where the large neck muscles attach. And they tend to be large in males and small in females. And in this case, they were very small. I asked Dominique if anyone had told him what he had there. And he said, no, they hadn't. And I said, well, what you've got here is the bones of a teenage girl and a bunch of really large megafauna. This is the first time we have a human skull in direct association with the skeleton of an extinct animal in the Americas, period. That's really exciting.
Over successive dives, the team finds and scans more bones belonging to the teenage girl. By 2013, they've documented her near-complete skeleton, and she has become more than simply an archaeological find.
Here we are in Hoyo Negro.
Yeah. Wow. I've always wanted to dive this. This is about the closest I'm ever going to come, I think. She's spread over about a 16-foot span here. What I stressed with the divers was that basically they needed to remember the personhood of these bones.
If you give it a name, you become more caring about this skeleton, and it goes from a skeleton to becoming a person. We had a lot of candidates for names. We decided to call it Naya.
Naiads were water spirits in Greek mythology. They were the female spirits that watched over small bodies of water. So it seemed a very fitting name for her.
Naya's remains are found close to Ice Age mammals, but that isn't enough to prove that Naya herself is prehistoric.
Our goal with Naya was to collect a specimen from the skeleton to use for radiocarbon dating. We chose to do 1/3 molar because third molars are often very simply rooted and therefore easy to take out of a skeleton.
There are a number of problems inherent in carbon dating, and those could include contamination. It was not a foregone conclusion that we were going to get a viable date from Naya.
We ran dates independently in 2 laboratories, fully expecting the dates to be completely different from each other, and it came back within 15 years. And between those translate to close to 12,900 years ago. It was pretty exciting to find out because only one other skeleton at that time had dated that old. And all that there was of that individual was one bone, not even a complete bone. The fact that Naya's skeleton is so complete makes her an incredibly rare find.
And as the oldest near-complete skeleton ever found in the Americas, Naya could provide answers about early humans living here. But to protect her remains, the team must first remove her from the cave.
So it's been 6-7 years of adventure, and although we didn't really want to take any human remains, we have to do it to protect them. And that's kind of what the day is all about, protecting Naya and her remains.
The operation to recover Naya's fragile skeleton begins with her skull. It is fraught with risk.
Well, we're doing the pre-dive practice, or the procedures drill.
Jim rehearses the recovery with a replica skull.
My end of it was designing how Naya's bones were going to be safely removed. Your strongest part is here. Your weakest points are here and here, so we want to protect them. This was a big deal. I mean, imagine I'm the one responsible for making sure that thing doesn't get destroyed in the collection process. So I was just a little on the nervous side. And just gently, chin first. Okay. And release. The reason Susan was the one to handle the bones had in part to do with the fact that she had very steady hands, but she also felt a linkage to the young woman who was in the cave.
And I just feel very connected with her spirit. I feel like she's been there a long time and is ready to go home.
There was one chance, and we had to get it right. The moment Susan picked up the skull, everybody's breathing stopped.
That was a really tense 3 hours of waiting to see if what would be in the box when it came up was a complete skull or a whole pile of bone fragments.
Here they come. My, oh my. Okay, Susan's on the left, Beto's on the right.
She comes to the surface and you know that as an archaeologist, you're never going to have another experience like this. I mean, this is it.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, she's fine in there. Nice. I remember getting down and peeking in the end and seeing a whole skull there, and tremendous elation that came from that. We got her out, and we got her out whole. Congratulations. Thanks, John. I've been at this for 60 plus years, and that was the top moment in all that time.
Hey.
We cried.
Naya's remains give the team an unprecedented opportunity to learn about America's early humans. A key question is whether Naya is a direct ancestor to modern Native Americans. In a replica of her skeleton, Jim looks for clues.
The characteristics that jumped out at me was the very distinct angularity to the back of her skull and the tendency for her face to project forward.
These are not common features of modern Native Americans.
They contrast with more recent Native American skulls represented by these casts here. Here's a female. You can see a much more rounded skull. The face is in a similar position, is much more straight up and down.
When the team turns to facial reconstruction technology, the mystery deepens.
What we got, we went from the printed skull here, and then this is how she turned out. I didn't expect her to look like she did. She almost looks like a South African bushman from the Kalahari Desert, or someone out of Southeast Asia. Her eyes are wider set, her nose is broader. So those are all things that were different from what I'm used to.
There's a mystery then. If she appears to be so different from the ancestors of modern Native Americans, where did she come from?
To find out, the team tests Naya's DNA.
When I got the result back, I was very happy that we got a result, but as happy as I was to get the result, it was not the result I expected. What it showed was that although Naya's skull seemed different from modern Native Americans, they still shared a genetic background. They shared the same heritage.
So, Naya is an ancestor of modern Native Americans. Now, the age of her skeleton, dated to the very end of the Ice Age, propels her into the center of one of the hottest controversies in science. How did she and her people get to the American continent?
So part of the question about Naya was, can she help contribute to an answer to that question?
For decades, experts agreed on how the first humans migrated to the Americas.
In school, studying archaeology, I heard a great deal about the Bering Land Bridge. During the last ice age, huge ice sheets blocked the land route from Siberia to Alaska. But when the ice thaws around 13,000 years ago, which is when Naya is living in the Yucatan, it becomes possible for humans to walk into America. And a group previously known as the Clovis people do just that.
The Clovis first model is that people came into the Americas by way of migrating through an ice-free corridor, exiting south of the ice, hunting megafauna like mammoths and bison, using a very specific kind of technology known as a Clovis spear point.
That view that this Clovis group were the people that had come across the Bering Straits and were the ancestors of modern Native Americans became so fixed in archaeological orthodoxy that to suggest an earlier date and other migrations was scientific heresy.
The question is, do Naya's people travel to the Yucatan through the opening ice-free corridor, or some other way?
The problem with explaining everything as an interior migration, that's just not an explanation that accounts for the facts. And the facts are that people are south of the ice before this ice-free corridor opens. The earliest sites, for example, are actually in South America. So there's one in Peru called Huaca Prieta, and there's another one in Chile known as Monteverde. Stone tools, bones, and charcoal from these sites show that humans were in the Americas at least 14,500 years ago, more than 1,000 years before the ice melts.
So, if ice is blocking the land route, how do these earliest Americans arrive?
They must have come here another way. So that's why we're interested in looking on the coast, because that is the easiest explanation to explain how we can get people south of the ice before this ice-free corridor opens up.
In 1997, scientists begin to uncover evidence of very early human habitation in this remote valley in Idaho.
As people were migrating south along the coast, they would have had ice to their left and the ocean to their right, and they would have encountered the Columbia River eventually. They may have decided to just simply take a left-hand turn south of the ice and penetrate into North America at that point. And if they kept going upriver, they would have made their way here to Cooper's Ferry.
Loren and his students search for stone tools that migrating humans may have left behind.
Well, if the site was old enough, we might actually find evidence of Clovis peoples. But sort of to my surprise, we didn't see that at all.
Did you see this thing?
What we did find instead were these other kind of spear points, and these are known as stemmed points. Stemmed points look very different than Clovis points. They have a little small rectangular tab at the bottom. That just made it very clear that we have some other kind of cultural pattern that's present at the site at the same time people were making Clovis artifacts somewhere else. When we first found these, I really didn't have any idea how old they were. So that was a big question. Radiocarbon dating showed us that points like these are 13,000 years old. Some of them were older, 14,000, 14,500. And it just blew our minds that this technology could actually be as old as Clovis and then even earlier.
Some challenge this, but if those dates are correct, that's 1,000 years before the ice-free corridor, and at least 2,000 before Naya's time. How might these people arrive? Are the stemmed points a clue?
The only other place that we find artifacts that look like this during the end of the last ice age are in the northern part of Japan on the island of Hokkaido.
Loren believes this shows how early people traveled into the Americas from the Far East, via the Ice Age coastline and rivers.
If we imagine that people might have been able to come along the coastline, along the northern Pacific, into the Americas, we don't really need to look much farther than Japan, the Russian Far East, and they show us that there's a population already in place. They are on the doorstep waiting to migrate their way into the Americas.
It didn't mean that you'd have to sail all the way across the Pacific or across the Atlantic. You just island hop from bay to bay, making your way, sometimes over a generation.
As new sites are being discovered that show us that people are south of the ice before an ice-free corridor opens, that requires us to really rethink things.
To truly understand human migration, Lauren needs to explore the Ice Age coastline. The problem is, it's now more than 400 feet underwater.
How can we find the evidence out there where it likely exists? And that takes us offshore, and we need to look beneath the waves. It's important to understand the coast from an archaeological perspective because it could be the place that holds evidence for the earliest peoples to come into the Americas.
Lauren Davis is searching for evidence that early settlers use a coastal route into the Americas. But he's not looking at today's coastline for a very good reason.
During the Ice Age, the coast of the continent looked very different to how it does now. When the ice melted, all that trapped water raised sea levels by over 400 feet. So any evidence of early peoples living on the coast are now deep underwater.
And that means searching below the waves, 30 miles out to sea.
Getting on this ship was a real breakthrough for us because it allowed us to then go out and ground truth our theoretical ideas.
We are off the northeast of Heceta Bank, which is off the central coast of Oregon.
We went out to the very edge of the ancient coastline. So these are areas that are about 130 meters below modern sea level.
Oh man, went off a cliff.
Lauren one day hopes to find evidence of prehistoric human settlements on this ancient coastline. The first step is to build an accurate picture of the hidden Ice Age landscape below the waves.
As sea level comes up, it brings a lot of sediment with it, and it will bury the ancient landscape that was once there. So this obscures our view. We really need a technique that allows us to see into the seafloor. And one of the tools that we use is called a sub-bottom profiler. And what this does is it sends a sound pulse into the seafloor, and it will reflect back an acoustic signal that it then turns into sort of a depth map.
Could we track a line bearing 317 at 0.4?
Merging the deep sea scans with data from computer models reveals a world not seen for millennia, the shoreline of Ice Age America.
If we were to lower the ocean down to about 13,000 years ago, the position where it was then, we would see a really different coastline. We would be able to see river valleys, we would see embayments, we would see a low mountain range. It would be a broad coastal plain that looks really different than the rugged, mountainous coastline of today's Central Coast.
That's a landscape with estuaries full of marine life, as well as seabirds and animals. And with that, we would see this lost world. The Americas as they were at the time of initial human settlement.
This story of ancient coastlines under lower sea level associated with the last ice age is not just an Oregon story. This is a story that happens everywhere.
Similar investigations are being conducted all along the Pacific coast.
As you go farther south, San Francisco would have been an area that isn't on the coast in the past. That is, lowered sea level would have taken it much farther away from its modern position, so San Francisco would have been really sort of an inland valley.
Having accurate mapping of North America's Ice Age coastline now allows Lauren to narrow his search for signs of early human habitation.
So if I'm a traditional hunter-gatherer, fisher person, and I'm living on an ancient coastline, where are the hot spots? Where are the places that are going to take care of me the best? And the estuaries are really, really important places for people. I mean, there's more calories per square meter in an estuary than almost any other place on the coast.
What really happened remains unclear, but Lauren and others continue to explore, debate, and seek new clues.
Archaeology works by making discoveries. In time, my bet is on that these discoveries are going to be made up and down the Pacific coast of the Americas.
This is more anatomical position here.
When Naya dies 13,000 years ago, early humans are arriving in North America via the ice-free corridor. And the place she is found in the Yucatan is only a few miles from the Ice Age coastline. So which route do Naya's people take? Jim hopes to find clues in Naya's remains.
Here we're looking at a micro CT scan. You see one little stress line right there. See that little line right along, right near the junction with the dentine?
He's looking for telltale signs of stress from her lifestyle and environment.
The other place we look is in the long bones and how they grow. Here we're looking at Naya's thigh bone, which is the longest bone and therefore the one that's going to give us the most detail. See these lines? These are the places where growth has been interrupted and then begun again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years we can see. And the spacing of those lines in Naya suggests that she had a protein deficiency during one season of every year.
And so she lived a kind of feast and famine life.
Seeing that Naya had protein deficiency during some times of the year raises the question of why was she protein deficient if she lived so close to the sea?
There's fish, there are crustaceans. The sea is a plentiful place.
Nothing we're seeing in the evidence for her diet is consistent with being marine adapted. It is quite consistent with being strictly terrestrial. Her people were not adapted to the coast.
Really what it suggests is that she was among these highly mobile hunter-gatherers who were heavily reliant on a successful hunt, their ability to hunt and to kill and to consume megafauna. And the fact that she appears unable to fish or make use of marine proteins, that really doesn't make sense if her people had traveled to the Americas via a coastal highway.
The most dangerous thing in science is to be disappointed when the evidence doesn't support your theory. So when Naya was found giving her age, it was like, wow, she had to be a coastal person. Well, that doesn't show up in her bones.
While she doesn't disprove the coastal migration theory, she certainly does not support it.
But that doesn't rule out others coming via the coastal route at least 2,000 years before her time.
It's just the most fascinating puzzle. I think it's likely that there were multiple migrations following different routes over thousands of years.
As for Naya, we are still finding out more about her life and death.
The hardest ones to work with are the young people. You think about a life not lived, but you also think about the impact of the loss of that individual on their parents, their siblings, their young spouses.
Now they want to piece together the clues to understand what may have happened to Naya in the Yucatan cave system 13,000 years ago.
When we're working with ancient human skeletons, we're dealing with the ultimate cold cases.
Jim Chatter's forensic examinations reveal an injury from which Naya would not have recovered.
We know from her pelvis, she struck the front of her pelvis here, and it broke away the pubic bones on both sides. These are these jagged breaks that you see here are green bone fractures. They're the kind of breaks that fresh bone gets, not old dead bone gets. This was a serious accident. It is not easy to break your pelvis. not to shatter it like that.
To determine what could have caused Naya's fatal injury, Dominique Rizzolo and Jim attempt to retrace her footsteps in the 3D replica of the cave.
It's impossible not to wonder why Naya was in the cave.
Hoyo Negro had a pool of water in the bottom. Was she there for water?
This would have been the route that she would have walked.
This is the most likely way she came in. This is the closest entrance, is about 2,000 feet behind us. Imagine she's deep in the cave and she's lost her way, which would be easy in these caverns. These tunnels, they join and separate and join and separate, and getting lost would be a very easy thing to do. You can turn to the left and work your way over some boulders.
Was she being pursued by another animal inside the cave?
She knows there are large, dangerous animals there.
So kind of climbing over these rocks so close to the edge. You know, maybe trying to find a way around the pit?
Otherwise, we can't get her over to where she fell. Eventually, her light's going to go out, and she's wandering in the dark. And suddenly, she takes one final step, and the bottom falls away. Whoa! From the floor of that tunnel to the surface of the water below was right about 100 feet, 30 meters. And if you look straight down off
right
the rim,
here. Yeah,
she's right down there.
Oh my goodness.
So you fall, okay, now Joel just swings straight down. From where her body was, it looks like she probably went through the water and smacked the rocks down below it. I imagine she was knocked unconscious and didn't know a thing after that.
What happens next sets in motion an extraordinary series of events which preserve Naya's remains for the next 13,000 years.
And what we see, of course, is global sea level rise. And those rising sea levels are pushing the fresh water that lies under the peninsula up. And this chamber is flooding, and it's flooding surprisingly fast. Over a few thousand years, we see a dry cave to a completely flooded one. It's a really rapid and incredible transformation.
That sealed the cave off. And it became absolutely isolated from the rest of the world. And it wasn't until cave divers, just exploring for the sheer joy of it, happened upon this huge black hole.
For Dominique and the team of scientists studying her, Naya's story is not yet complete.
She comes to us forward in time as a messenger and tells us of the life of people lost so long ago.
We know very little about her culture. We certainly don't know what language she spoke. We don't have stone tools. We don't have artifacts. Those have yet to be discovered.
One of these days, I hope that we actually find artifacts that are of very clear human origin. I hope that we find information about the foods that they're eating. We may even get as lucky as to find something that reflects the personal life of somebody. To me, it's only a matter of time.
The Battle of the Alamo is just an incredible story. It's an incredible part of Texas history.
The Mexicans battered that building with cannon for 13 days. But in the end, the Texans are all killed and the Alamo is taken.
The battle was a crushing defeat, but it was also a crucial step on the road to an independent Texas. The Alamo is intrinsic to Texas identity.
It's like a foundation myth, an origin story. It is the soul of Texas.
But the fact is that the Alamo was just one battle in the middle of a revolution that had been brewing for 2 decades.
If that revolution hadn't succeeded, the United States might look very different today.
The story of how Texas was born relies more heavily on myth or legend than evidence.
There's usually some truth behind the myths of history.
There are secrets hidden in these historic sites. The question is, can we find them?
Okay, let's see. No, I'm not gonna call myself a gun nut. My dad collected antiques, but he also had replica firearms as well. In some ways, I feel it's actually somewhat natural that I became an archaeologist. It was the weapons from the early history of Texas that got me hooked on the Alamo. Not just the battle in 1836, but the years of conflict that led up to it. It was such a militarized period. Historic firearms actually got me entangled in a mystery I've worked on all my professional life. One day I was just walking through the lab and I saw this container, kind of a bucket of firearm pieces. You know, you have a trigger guard and you have a side plate, some of them covered with marine growth. And I saw it and I'm like, oh wow, what is this weaponry? It was exciting because I love historic firearms. These gun parts were being stored in water because they were found on the seabed. And what is interesting is that this was a critical strategic entry point into Texas. Paz Cavallo was a natural channel from the Gulf of Mexico into Matagorda Bay in the 1800s. It was extremely treacherous at the time, and lots of ships were lost there. These weapons look like they were from a ship that wrecked in the 1800s, maybe around the time of the rebellion in Texas. But the divers who found it had a problem. There wasn't really anything left of the ship. Nobody knew what the ship was, or where it was going, or what it was even doing here. The question was, are there enough clues to uncover its story? It was in maybe 20 feet of murky black water. The wooden hull had been ripped away by currents or eaten by worms. But there was important evidence remaining, like ballast stones used to stabilize the ship, and weapons. There were cannonballs, musket balls, and bar shot, which is like a dumbbell you would fire out of a cannon to rip up enemy rigging. For me, the most exciting thing was this collection of firearm parts. Decorative brass plates that would have once been screwed to the butt, trigger guards, or mains of the gun barrels. This was such an extraordinary collection. It could be a merchant ship, a naval vessel, or even pirates. The problem is, with so little left, how would you know? That's where I came in. The best chance of identifying the wreck were those gun parts. I made it my mission to find out. as these artifacts deteriorate underwater, you end up getting this kind of conglomerate that sort of covers these artifacts. So the first thing I had to do was to try to see what's inside this concrete-like mass. And to do that, I had to x-ray each one. And once you get past all that stuff that's on the outside, you can begin to see the individual components. And when I saw the firing mechanism, I knew exactly what I was looking at. We had several examples of
the ramrod guides?
Yeah, it was clear what these guns were. They were a type of weapon called a flintlock musket. With the flintlock, you were using this essentially metal and stone to transfer a spark into a gun barrel that would cause an ignition and propel the musket ball. This was the main firearm technology of the early 1800s, right up to the time of the Alamo. I wanted to know where these specific guns came from. We just had a lot of, kind of unarticulated pieces.
Right, okay. Did you have any of the trigger guards?
We had the trigger guards, we had the side plates, and then the butt plates.
So you might see manufacturer marks on the lock here.
I knew that information could be encased beneath the concreted layers. To get to it meant days of painstaking labor with a pneumatic drill, just delicately chipping away. But it was so worth it. As I was deconcreting these and removing that material, I was revealing British crown and tower marks. These were British-made firearms. The fact that they were British meant I could finally zero in on a date. These British military arms were available throughout the region, especially in the 1820s and moving forward from there. This was a time of revolution. First Mexico fighting for independence from Spain, and then Texas rebelling against the Mexican government. These guns were used throughout that history, throughout that region, including at the Battle of the Alamo. So which part of Texas's turbulent history did these weapons belong to? There was one particularly fascinating thing about the way these arms appeared on the wreck. We had individual arms, but we also had these arms that were stacked, end to end. When I was mechanically cleaning them, I was finding this organic stuff like straw. It's this packing material. It's like the bubble wrap of the 1800s. And to me, that was super exciting because it indicated that these were boxed together. These were cargo. They were being shipped. Someone was trafficking these guns around Texas. And the question is, who? And who to? The guns couldn't tell me that, so I had to dive into the historical records. I did so much research. I literally used to go to sleep at night and have dreams that I was in the battles of the Texas Revolution because I was reading so much material. I was just following all this maritime traffic and looking for these arms shipments. I just needed to know when this ship sank. I created a database for every single ship I was coming across. But there wasn't any kind of smoking gun that could say this is exactly what this vessel is. I had nowhere else to go. But then, after 10 years, something finally turned up on a totally different wreck, thousands of feet deep, in the Gulf of Mexico. I was a part of the team that was sample collecting artifacts from the Monterey Shipwreck Project. It's a deep water shipwreck that's about 180 miles off of Texas and Louisiana Gulf, and it had a collection of weapons. I kind of got myself invited, I think. I was like, I have to work on this project, in part because of my gun expertise.
We are on the seafloor, yep. Anchor coming up.
To go out there at sea and to see this really beautiful visibility, it was neat. You're just kind of approaching this sort of sleeping, resting, kind of ghostly shape of this ship. And I remember when we were approaching it from the bow, like you could see that we had a musket box.
Zoom in on that, please.
We would get closer and we would zoom in, and then you could really start seeing really the details.
That's a trigger guard if I've ever seen one.
I got super excited. You could see some of the regimental marks. Each Army regiment had its own unique number, and that number was often etched onto the regiment's weapons, so you can trace the musket's history. When we got those butt plates off of the seabed, it was so clear that there was a link to my wreck. From Pascavallo, we had regimental marks from at least 3 different British groups, but the one that was the most interesting was this 41st Regiment, because these arms from the Monterey wreck, they had that same 41st Regimental mark on those guns in the same place. The source of those arms could have been exactly the same. There was nothing on the Pascavallo wreck that could easily date it, but on this ship, we had a wealth of artifacts that, together, could be pinned to a more specific time. It kind of came down in the end to a plate, and then there was a decanter, a glass container, and both of those artifacts sort of placed us in a period of at least 1810 to 1815. This was a time of turmoil in North America, with different nations and states battling for control or independence. Too early for the Alamo, but that's right in the sweet spot for those years of conflict that led up to the battle. Finally, I had something. After 15 years, I went straight to my database. I had a hunch I already had a wreck that sank around that time that had a cargo matching the artifacts. There was an account of a shipwreck from 1817 that was associated with the privateer Louis Michel Aury. And that ship had arms on it. Aury was a privateer who was contracted by Mexican revolutionaries. And in June of 1817, he loaded up a vessel with arms, and he proceeded to leave Matagorda Bay through Pascavallo, and he ran aground and wrecked. I have a lot of confidence that what we're looking at really could represent this 1817 wreck. Aury was right in the thick of it. These guns would have been meant for soldiers fighting in the Mexican Revolution against Spain. This has gone from a bucket of artifacts in the lab to a shipwreck with a story. And that story played out at a critical time in the history of North America. This was just one shipment of weapons. But privateers like Aury, trafficking guns just like these, changed the course of history. This region was a powder keg, primed with these weapons. And in 1836, it blew up at the Alamo.
I grew up in San Antonio. Early 1950s, I was here going to elementary school, and we did various day trips. And One of them was to visit the Alamo. Someone talked us through the story, and we were told that it was the shrine of Texas liberty. Davy Crockett died there, Travis died there, Bowie died somewhere here. 185 men died here to keep Texas free from the tyranny of the dictator Santa Anna, and that was my first encounter with the place. I never imagined that all this time later, I'd wind up finding a piece of Alamo history that had been lost for 150 years. When the Alamo fell and the defenders were killed, the troops left behind to hold San Antonio were ordered to destroy the defenses of the Alamo so it couldn't be used against Mexico again. Virtually nothing was left. All that remains today is the iconic chapel. The story goes that the Mexicans were attacking a fort with thick defensive walls. Now, how do we know that's true? Some people thought there was simply nothing left to be found around Alamo Plaza. I was convinced they were wrong. I spent years poring over documents detailing what those walls looked like and where they might have stood. I then drew up a possible outline of the original Alamo. The job then was to find out if there was anywhere at all we could dig to find those legendary stone walls. These maps are all what are called fire insurance maps. Pink-colored buildings are brick, blue buildings are stone, and so on. And in appropriate cases, it says whether there is a basement. What I wanted to know was, after 150 years of construction, was there any of the original battleground left underground? Since 1836, the Alamo Chapel and its surroundings have transformed. Huge brick buildings, hotels, bars, souvenir stores, anything beneath them would have been obliterated. But opposite the chapel, there was a possible opportunity. Of the whole west side, only this structure is indicated as having no basement. That meant the original surface might still be there. It began to really look likely that a radio and electronics hobbyist store was sitting effectively just on the only undisturbed stretch of wall on the entire length of the plaza. By the time we actually got the key to the back door, they had emptied out all of their equipment. So it was essentially just an empty, echoing space with a stripped wooden floor. And we stood there in it and looked around, and I think it was Wayne Cox that said, well, let's do it here. And he slams the big iron metal pick into the floor and punches a hole between two of the boards. A big chunk of it pops up, and I think he said, somebody else look, I don't have the nerve. And we shined the flashlight in, and there was dirt. No basement. That meant the area wasn't disturbed. It wasn't until then that we knew that that was the one, the only, the big chance to find the Alamo Fortress. Well, the next day we started prying up all of the floorboards, and we broke out the trowels.
It was like a dense cheese, a little harder to cut than cheddar, but not as hard as Parmesan. We were scraping, and immediately we were feeling that chunk feel of hitting adobe. And we were totally puzzled by this. Adobe has a mixture of sand, clay, and chopped hay as a binder. We'd all assumed the outer perimeter of this legendary fortress was made out of stone. Whatever this was, it certainly wasn't that. We were scraping on the top of adobe bricks. We scraped and scratched on it a little more, and it ran all the way across the building. At that point, we accepted that that was it. There was really no question. Nearly 150 years after it had been razed to the ground, we'd found the original outer wall of the Alamo. I mean, it was remarkable, and I still can't get over it. It told me that my survey notes for the entire enclosure was correct. To realize that you didn't have to depend on the legends, that was essentially a game changer. We finally knew the nature of the structure that they were defending. Big sections of the wall that stood between the massive Mexican army and those 200-odd Texans were built out of mud brick. They didn't have a chance. They did not. It felt like this was just the beginning. We were standing right on the battle's front line. This was an incredible opportunity to dig deeper and probe some of the myths about the battle itself. There's so many things we don't understand about the Battle of the Alamo, who was fighting where, what they were firing, everything. But we ran out of time. The city had to pave over the site, and that seemed to be the end of it. But then 40 years later, I got a call.
When I learned I was going to be digging at the Alamo, I have to admit I was terrified. It is such an iconic place, and the archaeology is so significant. I mean, this is a dream, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The city had planned some improvements in the area and gave us a few weeks to open up some excavation units. Those excavation units were in the paved walkway that now covers Jake's old dig units from 40 years before. That area right next to Jake's excavation was really the last remaining patch of the west wall left to explore. This really was keyhole archaeology. Almost immediately, we started finding artifacts that told a far different story than the myth of the Alamo. In the area within the outer wall, there were things like colorful beads used for jewelry and shards of glass from bottles. This isn't battlefield archaeology. As we're troweling, when you hit something like a piece of pottery, it makes a different sound, and so you know immediately you found something.
When we find household pottery on an archaeological site, it typically means someone was living there.
These finds are showing the Alamo not as a fortress, but as a home.
By 1836, the Alamo had been inhabited by people for 112 years.
On the eve of the battle, you had a real mix of people who had been establishing this community within the walls of the Alamo. The traditional Alamo battle story focuses solely on those Americans like Davy Crockett and William Barrett Travis, but in reality, they'd only been on the scene for a few weeks.
The archaeology is telling us that focusing on the legend of the Alamo misses a huge part of the story. All of the soil that's excavated is put through a fine screen so that we can make sure that we capture all of the artifacts.
And of course, as soon as somebody finds something, we all stop and, what do you have? What do you have?
We're screening dirt from a unit, and all of a sudden you see this green. If you've had any experience, you'll know immediately that's a copper or a bronze artifact.
Everybody's trying to look at it and see what they think it is. And he said, you know, I really think this is a finial from a gun. It's a possible battle-related artifact, and it's not something you find every day.
A brass or bronze finial is a decorative element that you'd find on a musket that dated to the late part of the 18th century and to the early part of the 19th century.
But the really important thing is this. The weapon that this decoration came from would not have been something that the Americans would have used during the battle. It's possible that the gun associated with that finial could have been used by the local Texan community. They were called Tejanos.
Tejano is the Spanish word for Texan. So what is a Texan? Is it someone who comes after 1836? Or is it the person who was here 150, 200 years earlier and is still here today? A Hispanic or Latino, Mexican American, growing up in Texas before 1960s civil rights revolution in America, was not taught their own history. Initially, my mission was to find my own identity. One of my professors introduced me to the archives of Texas. I didn't look up for another 3 years. I lived in those documents. This is the document by which Juan Seguin, a Tejano, a native of Texas, was commissioned as a captain in the Texas Army by Stephen F. Austin, the general of the Texas Army. Seguin brought his company of Tejanos to also fight with him. And it's signed in October of 1835. These are the people who built up the Alamo just before the battle in March of 1836. They were in the Alamo, and they fought alongside Davy Crockett and William Travis in the Alamo against the Mexican government. We don't have all of the names of all of the Tejanos who fought, but we do have probably, I would say, 50 to 100 names, soldiers of Texas. A lot of people think that Texas is Anglo-Americans who came to Texas and fought for independence, and that's true, but the Tejanos were the ones who gave the Anglo-Americans the freedom to do that in Texas.
The story of the siege and fall of the Alamo is iconic, it's mythic. It's just that it's not the only story to be told at the Alamo. This wasn't just the last heroic stand of a bunch of Anglo-Americans. We're uncovering details that challenge that myth.
This was also a community of Tejanos fighting for their idea of Texas. They were defending not a military fort, but a fragile mud brick home. In the end, after 13 days of siege, the Alamo was overrun, and all the surviving defenders, Anglo-American and Tejano, were killed.
The Alamo is still what the world remembers when it comes to the Texas Revolution. But that was a horrific defeat for the Texans. What secured Texas' independence actually came 6 weeks later. After the Battle of the Alamo, the Mexican army began moving eastward, and ultimately they ended up camping right in this area at the San Jacinto battleground site. The story goes that a thrown-together army of 900 Texans faced off with a professional Mexican force of 1,300. And this time, the Texans won. This was a complete reversal of the Alamo. The main fighting lasted just 18 minutes. It's long been a mystery. How did the Texans beat them so thoroughly? I have a very deep military history within my family. And my master's thesis was focused around this early section of Texas history. The traditional story of the Battle of San Jacinto is that the plucky Texans managed to catch the Mexican army off guard and asleep, and managed to drive the Mexicans off the battlefield. The idea that such a small army of Texans and Tejanos, mostly volunteers, could have beaten a larger, more professional army like the Mexican army didn't make sense. So I wanted to find out just how did that happen. All of the previous attempts at finding artifacts out at the battlefield found nothing. But we knew that that was the only place to look if we hoped to find new evidence. And there was a big challenge right from the start. Over the last nearly 2 centuries, the battleground has changed. Before it became a park, it was used for farmland and for grazing. Industry began to move in. And so it really is hard to get a feel for what the battlefield looked like in 1836. When you're looking at a 200-year-old battlefield, the first thing you have to do is figure out the landscape. And not the landscape as it looks now, but the landscape as it looked at the time of the battle.
I'm a geologist, so I've always been interested in terrain and maps. As soon as I looked at the site, I knew we were going to need evidence of where the conflict really took place. It is almost unrecognizable from what was there 200 years ago. We have one old map that is spectacularly informative about the battle. It includes the positions of the troops, the movement of those troops, the encampments. It is a map that was drawn as a sketch map. We determined there might be features on that map that we could use to relate that map to the more modern landscape. If you stack maps up from different time periods, you can basically walk back in history. The earliest aerial photography that we could find was flown almost 100 years after the original battle, but the vegetation had changed very little. So we were able to take the vegetation that we could recognize in this 1930 aerial photograph and match it with the battle map. It was a real eureka moment. Once we have that, we can make a 3D model. This was the Rosetta Stone of the battlefield. We were able to remove all of those modern clutter from our map. We were able to remove the obelisk and other features that related to the memorial. This 3D model also showed us the places that were low in modern times were higher. The terrain was different. What we are left with is the original surface. Now we have the battlefield.
Peter's model meant that we had a much better sense of where to search for the artifacts. The next challenge was how to actually find them under all the grass and dirt.
I've been metal detecting for almost 30 years. When I first met with the people at San Jacinto, they told me that their theory was that there was nothing left. I told them my opinion. I knew there was stuff there.
We chose to look for the Mexican camp because it was assumed that that would be where the debris of conflict would still remain if there was any left. Greg Demick is very good at what he does. Every little beep and click and sound that comes out of that machine tells him something.
One of the very first items that we found, we got it out of the dirt, we felt the weight of it, and we realized it was lead, and it was circular. We realized right away that it was a musket ball.
Inches below the surface, we found hundreds of musket balls and rifle balls, but it quickly became clear something wasn't right. Measuring the musket balls helped us to determine which side that they came from. If the legends were true and the Mexicans were asleep in their tents, we should find little evidence of the Mexicans being engaged in combat. But that's not what we found. We found definitive evidence of both Mexican and Texan shot. Our evidence suggested a full-on conflict here. All of this close combat shows us that the Mexicans were not asleep. The myths appear to be wrong. So what really happened here? One thing that we were hoping to find in the artifacts at the battlefield was some evidence of why the victory at San Jacinto was so lopsided. The number of Mexican dead was more than 600. On the Texan side, it was 10 or 11. It was in the middle of this conflict zone that we discovered some weird metallic objects. They turned out to be critical clues. We did not know what they were at first. There were scratches along a curved surface. That curvature matched the inside of a cannon barrel. We realized that this was lead shot that the Texans were firing out of their cannon. Once we realized what the lead pieces were, we went back and looked at the distribution of those artifacts in our mapping system. I was like, oh, there's a cone. If you follow that cone back to its source, you can see the approximate location of where the Texas cannon would have been firing from. That immediately raised questions. The cone fell behind the position of the Texas cannon on the battle map. What was going on? The answer came from a letter written very shortly after the battle by the Texas General Sam Houston. His letter includes an unusual detail of the cannon being fired from 2 different positions. The cone didn't match the map because the map only showed the final position of the cannon. The Texas cannon weren't fixed in position, as most artillery was at the time. They were moved during the battle. This artillery tactic was cutting edge. The myth looks wrong again. These Texas gunners were no amateurs. They were skilled artillerists. You don't get a lot of moments like this in a career, unless you're some like show business archaeologist. All these pieces coming together in this one moment on a map, in my computer, in my office. Highly trained Texan gunners would have been a huge advantage. But that alone doesn't explain the disparity in the casualty counts. So we took our detectors back to the battlefield and widened our search of the conflict zone. And that's where we found something. 800 yards away from where the Mexican cannon was firing from, we found copper shot. Only Mexico used copper in their ammunition. To have been able to fire this type of ammunition 800 yards away, they would have had to raise the elevation of their cannon to an extreme level. As we moved the search to the line of the Texan advance, we found a key piece of evidence. Mexican copper shot that seems to have landed behind the Texas infantry. They were firing over the Texans' heads. For some reason, when the Texas infantry advanced, the Mexican artillerists failed to lower the elevation of their cannon. This was a huge discovery for us. It finally explained what went wrong for the Mexican army. Either somebody was distracted because they were being shot at, or maybe actually the person who was responsible for that job was already dead.
I think the archaeology and the artifacts that we found at San Jacinto have changed the story of the battle.
Even today, Texas school children are taught that the Battle of San Jacinto, and in fact the Texas independence itself, was won by sheer pluck. What the archaeology proves is that there's so much more to how the battle was won than that.
The Texans were organized and they had a plan when they attacked.
Texas training and tactics were far better than the myths would have us believe. Where Texas artillery succeeded, critically, the Mexican cannon failed. On such narrow margins, Texas independence was won. If it had not gone the way it did, Texas and America might have been very different places today.